Hello, and welcome to not necessarily broadcast from Fiddler's Green, my weekly podcast, but instead a discussion show, which I will periodically use to replace my monologue podcast. I wanted to talk about a variety of sort of more real world things. I think it's very palatable that we are in kind of a political dead zone, so to speak, in terms of the culture war, in terms of developments in politics generally. And certainly the thing that's been on my mind the most is it seems that the COVID regime has now passed away. I'm not saying that the powers that have been absorbed by the federal government have passed away. I'm just saying that the hard restrictions and the era of COVID hysteria has probably waned for the foreseeable future. And we're kind of left to left to deal with the aftermath. And so I wanted to discuss this issue of de-atomization. Is it possible? Is this something that can be a utility for the right? And just generally, what does a post-COVID humanity look like? What does the good life look like after everything we've experienced over the last 2 years? And on the show today, I have with me the Prudentialist, who everyone knows and loves, a long time collaborator. I don't think I've had you on too many live streams, Prudentialist.
I think the only time that we've been on was to promote the U.S. event about a year ago, so this is a pleasure for me, to say the least.
Oh, really? I have to have you on more often. Prudentialist has been one of the rising voices in our spheres, and he's joined by another rising voice as well, J Burden.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Dave.
Yeah, J Burden runs I think, an interview show. And obviously, everyone here probably knows Prudentialist from Substack and his own YouTube channel. I feel like I've certainly talked a lot about Prudentialist, even though I haven't had him on the live stream. So, guys, welcome. I don't know. I'll just throw the question to you guys generally about what does the West look like in the year 2023? What are our prospects? And how do you see kind of modern politics playing out at a very basic level?
So, Prue, do you want to take this first?
Sure. I'll take on first string here for this one. I suppose the question that you had posed at the beginning, though, about post-COVID, right, that we've witnessed now for the last 2.5 years, people have led themselves to a work from home. Life has transitioned from the IRL to the online world. And I guess this feels like the time to more or less talk about everything I've mentioned as a project in 2022 is that I've noticed, especially for people my age, 27 and younger, that there has been all aspects of communication, familial relations, dating, marriage, has all been given a very big chunk of distance, not geographically, but digitally, to where all of those relations and interactions are through computer-mediated communication. And that comes with its own debilitating effects, where the inability to read tone or the growing desire to rather text, maybe not do things in the real world, or just maybe FaceTime it and go on with it. And it's made it very easy for people to write off the benefits of doing things in the real world, whether that's just going out and having a drink with friends or doing even basket weaving and things like that. The one benefit, I think, for sure is that people on our side of things, in our neck of the woods, politically speaking, are aware of the fundamental dehumanizing and atomizing aspects that has, to where you are digitally deracinated, you're uprooted from your culture, you are caught up on the latest trends based upon the algorithms that you feed into, and they feed back into you. And it's important for us to break from that. I've tried talking about this for a good chunk of last year, and I think that the important takeaways have been self-discipline, but also treating this problem for what it is, which is, I think, partially an addiction, but also something that the state really wants to force down your throat. And that we can't look at it in the same way that we would call out an alcoholic for having a problem. And you have to treat it with maybe a more finesse. You can't point them to, a playlist of Gregorian chants and tell them to touch grass or things like that. Basically, my event talk from last year. But I think that those are some of the bigger struggles that we have to face. And I think that it will provide an emphasis on leadership, community elders, or even people that have taken up the responsibility to organize things in real life and to share our own secrets and our own stories of what helps us succeed. I mean, I give up Twitter on the weekends. I literally uninstall the app on my phone every weekend, and that helps a lot to reset me. So those are
That's a
some
nice
thoughts.
touch. Yeah, I mean, I really get the sense, and let Jay Burton come in here too. But I really get the sense that this is a generational problem. Now, what happened, and I see this very distinctly at my parish, and at workplaces too, is that COVID kicked off. We basically experienced about 5 or 6 years in two. It was a mass acceleration of a process that was happening already, namely the baby boomers exiting the workforce and leadership roles en masse. And so what's kind of happened is that millennials have been thrown into the spotlight, and the boomers have they're just checked out. We have a lot of boomers going into retirement. We have a lot of a long-awaited retirement, I should say. They went into retirement late. We have a lot of Xers going into early retirement because of COVID. And we have millennials just kind of sitting there not really knowing what to do. And, the Zoomers kind of in tow looking at an uncertain future. I always get the generations wrong. Jay Burden, I know you consider yourself a Zoomer. Prudentialist, you're either a younger millennial or a Zoomer. What do you consider? What cohort do you consider yourself in?
I would consider myself a younger millennial. I have a very distinct and living memory I can recall of 9/11. That's my idiosyncratic way of delineating between the two.
That's a good one. That's a good one. The other way is, do you think the Star Wars prequels were good movies or not?
Oh, well, in that category, I guess I'm a Zoomer then.
Oh, you think they're good? Okay.
Well,
wow.
I share the childish nostalgia for them. I know that they're awfully written and things like that, but if I'm going to put them on, I'm going to enjoy them regardless.
Okay, I always say that you can always tell millennials from Zoomers because with their opinion on those movies, because of the nostalgia factor and all that. But it's that's interesting to hear. But anyway, I mean, it is. There was this infuriating video. I don't know if you guys caught it. There's this little TikTok of these boomers. They're like getting up at 11, having coffee in retirement, going like, "Oh man, I'm scared shitless of the world. I want to do something like write a novel, put on Joni Mitchell. I want to say something to the world, but I don't know. I just want to be grateful for the time I have." And you can feel every millennial and Zoomer watching it, just kind of wanting to reach into the screen and strangle these people. But the generation I've noticed is that it's now become very clear of the problems we're tackling in the right wing. And but really, there's no more audience among boomers and older generation Xers to hear this stuff. They've all decided to just kind of check out and let the chips fall where they may. And that's my sense of things.
I completely agree with you. And the way you described it is, kind of like 5 years happening at once. Because I think that even before we could kind of see the trends that, that we were kind of witnessing the birth of a new state religion, so to speak. There had been this kind of like political, religious, syncretic mix, so to speak, kind of forming around progressive politics. And I think that became very nakedly real and very nakedly present over the pandemic. And I agree with you that the boomers have really stepped back. Even in the workplace, it seems like, and even when I talk to, boomers in my real life, they seem resigned. They seem to basically have gone like, well, I don't know what to do. I can't fix it. I'll be dead soon.
We also include your older Gen Xers too.
Yes. Many of whom, like you said, have retired early. And so in a weird way, the constant complaint from millennials was always like, oh, well, we're immature because we never had a chance to take on more responsibility. And now in a weird way, many millennials are still in a state of arrested development, but now they are kind of being expected to be grown-ups. And we talked about this the other day, Dave, where there's this weird situation going on right now, in the Biden admin, where it seems like this administration is kind of vacillating, like two hands are on the wheel pulling in opposite directions. And on one hand, you have, kind of like baby boomer neocon types, like the American empire. And then on the other, you essentially have like terminally online millennials, both wrestling for control of a senile old man. And that is both true of Joe Biden and kind of true of, broader American culture in a weird way. And so to me, I resonate very much with what we said, Prude, in that it does kind of seem like the critiques that the right wing made, it was easy when, the economy was going well, everything was kind of fine and dandy. And sure, there were SJWs, but you know what? Gas was cheap. And it was kind of easier to see those as kind of higher level complaints, things that aren't necessarily at the base of Maslow's hierarchy. But to me, and I think that in addition, I had this feeling, and I know that, kind of like, our mutual friend, Pete Quinones had this feeling where all of a sudden it was kind of like, oh, wait a minute. Politics kind of reached out and touched him, came into his life and basically said, or came into my life and basically said like, all right, you're stuck at home now. Yeah. We are going to, this is not just someone on college campus. This is not just someone in a TV show you don't like. Like, this is someone who is going into your living room and basically said like, if you don't do what we want, you're going to jail. And I think that kind of like rapid politicization, seemed incredibly jarring because it happened so quickly. And I think that after that, like you said, like the COVID may have gone away, but the regime hasn't. And it seems to me that there's a possibility where after 2022, this isn't what happened, but it could have happened, that, things would have kind of gone back to quote unquote normal. They would have put intersectionality back in its box. They would have, allowed, Red America to take a W, even if it was just the appearance of a W. And to me, right, that didn't happen. And that means, as far as I can tell, that like, well, this is kind of, and I hate this phrase, but it was one that was kind of popular during the pandemic, that like, well, this is the new normal. Mm-hmm. And so again, when it comes to, well, why do you talk on the internet? Kierkegaard has this idea about introspection, right? That you ought to inspect yourself. You ought to reason about, why do I feel this? Why do I think this? But you don't do that for its own sake. You don't become the Ouroboros, just like eternally turning in on itself. You do that in order to, once you understand yourself, to go outward. And to me, I think that's why, so many of us have been really, shilling, basket weaving, shilling doing things in real life. And it's because all of the kind of low level background social interaction that all of us had easily, that you could just go out with friends for drinks. You could go to a church that was, at least largely full. That got taken away. And the decision to be social, the decision to interact with people, was a deliberate and risky one. And I think that what it led to is this kind of like preference cascade, where it was no longer required of you, required of us to interact with people. And I think that a lot of us, and I've seen people like this, just decided to drop out, just decided to check out. Like, that's too much work. I have social anxiety. I have this, I have that. Yeah. And sorry, I'm not trying to, suck up all the air in the room here, but to me, at least, it seems like we're at a point at which we are having to actively decide to make an impact in the real world, both, as individuals and also as political actors.
That's my sense. And the thing is that there need to be sort of success stories of this. I'll say this though too. One of the reasons why I'm so interested in de-atomization, or at least reversing the atomization partially that occurred during COVID, is that I think that the left ultimately benefits from politics as an entertainment product. And once politics becomes more real, once social realities become more real, the left might suffer sort of a mortal blow to its perception of authenticity. Once people understand what real life is, they'll understand just how sort of fake these politics of the online left are, and the whole thing will stop being fun for them. And, what's it ultimately going to mean? Is that going to stop the global American empire? No, but it creates a situation where it creates a situation where a lot of the things we might have had to worry about might not be as a big of a deal anymore. For instance, I've gotten the distinct impression that the time of cancel culture is kind of coming to a close. The left its enthusiasm is waning distinctly. And as long as you don't cross any of the very serious lines, the prospects of cancellations seem to be much more rare now, and they might have been in 2020 or 2019 even. And this is an opportunity if we can beat the left off the line and rediscover how to actually live human lives and kind of make that a part of what it means to be a right winger. The left's path back to any kind of prominence as a distant force is much more rocky, and that lack of an alternative is going to be huge for the for I think people who are looking for a genuine alternative to what we have now.
So I might just slightly disagree with your take on cancel culture.
Oh, you think
I
it's ramping
that,
up?
No, I think that it is moved. I think that
Ah.
cancel culture no longer has to operate from the left. I think that we've seen a turn of the ratchet. And so now I think that, and maybe this is just my personal experience, but it seems to me as though the right, kind of like the good conservative, your red state millennial, your red state Gen Xer has kind of adopted the value system of 2018 progressivism, and so is they are kind of willing to take out the trash, and so I agree that there might be less public clamor for this, and a big part of that is just that people are spending, when you're stuck at home all day, you can spend endless hours on social media, less so when you're at a job, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that pressure is still there. It's just coming from kind of the center right now.
Well, I mean, it's odd because there does seem to be a very marked decline in enthusiasm from the left, properly conceptualized. Sorry, Prudentialist.
Oh well, all I was going to add was two things. Was that I think that we have to not underestimate the sheer addictive value that kind of day-to-day entertainment has. I know that Dave and I are in a chat where they were kind of, I think Ubersoy had done some kind of like spreadsheet of like what BreadTube talks about and covers.
Yeah.
And it's literally based on what the algorithm on Twitter or other forms of social media talk about.
Yeah.
It's topical, but that stuff is fundamentally addicting, and it's very easy to monetize and get people to sucked in. Outrage culture, I think, is just not going to disappear whether or not people get canceled or not. But the one thing that is really fundamental, and I think Jay, you mentioned this at the beginning, is that there were some things that were already going on before COVID that the regime easily took advantage of. Dave, I don't know how many people you know who did this, but when I finished my undergrad, there were countless people I know who decided to go get a master's degree because they didn't want to face the real world. They were like, I'll put it off. I'll go get a degree and we'll figure it out. And a lot of them stayed in academia that way. And I think that those are things that people were easily ready to take on. Is that we speak in generations, which is funny because Kierkegaard talks about that in the present age. We view things in generations. Our individuality has been erased for sort of this leveled monoculture where, in 2023, everything's got to be fake, gay, or trans. And so that's your individuality in that respect. And I think that we can't underestimate how powerful and alluring that is for a person that is completely deracinated and devoid of meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to save everybody, but I think on this side of things, we have to remind people that politics can't be some gotcha game or chinko machine that they can get constantly addicted to, that there are things worth doing, and that we have to point people in the direction of, well, what does that healthy sort of lifestyle look like for us?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to beat the left at the dopamine machine game. I don't know why we would want to. I guess I do know why we would want to. We would want to because that's the way you get clout and the ability to organize a large number of people online, which is all that we've really had. There was this thing back in 2016 where people said that, well, the online is the space where the right's strong. And I feel that's almost kind of reversed. I guess I'm not so familiar with the, Jay Burden, this is one of the reasons why I find kind of your content so fascinating is that you kind of get the mirror inversion of sort of the places where I've lived my entire life, because maybe the Republican, like the normie cons, are taking up the mantle of cancellation culture in red state America. But the normie cons in this area are just the people who are not Democrats. They're just done. They don't care anymore. They put up with so much of this shit that I don't think they're like ideological. They're not directed into doubting sort of the core tenets of our society the way that I think, we are. But they're not. They understand that this is a game, and that they're sort of the designated losers of America. And I find that promising. I find it exciting. I feel like it would only take a little bit of a spark and a hint of human interaction and hope to get people to kind of seriously decide to live differently and orient themselves towards society differently. Why don't people? I mean, this is a generational problem, right? But people need to kind of organize and direct Zoomers a little bit more, is what I'm thinking. Obviously, I'm not in the position to organize parties or anything like that, being the kind of wage cuck family guy that I am. But this is sort of what always struck me as like this possibility that, like, if human life arrived as something that you could go to, how many young people would actually try to take the opportunity and explore something new?
So there are several things there, which is one that the trend that you've seen of kind of like red state, or sorry, of like boomer, like Republicans kind of becoming resigned is something I've also seen. But what I think, and maybe this is just because I'm in a slightly more conservative area with kind of a culture lag, is that there's this resignation, but it's more of a resignation to please just don't hurt me anymore. So you've seen this specifically around the talk, because I don't look, I'm not a huge Trump guy, but nonetheless, I've seen this around the conversation about, well, who are the Republicans going to nominate? And in my experience, a lot of kind of like, older Republicans are absolutely terrified of Trump running again, because they don't want a president who's going to get hit like Trump did. And they don't want to be associated with someone who has that much vitriol directed against them. And so and I can't remember his name, but there's a black Republican senator from South Carolina. I can't remember his name. He's not particularly important, but for a while he was like the hot guy in Republican circles, because it was like, oh, well, they can't hit us if we have a black guy. Like they'll stop saying, this, they'll stop saying that. And so to me, if I saw more of that, like, oh, this thing's all rigged, I'm just opting out, I would actually agree with you. I'd feel more hopeful. But at least in my, limited personal experience, it's kind of more of a return to that, just like, well, we'll try extra hard this time, and they can't say we're racist if. But yeah. Prue, did you have something to add?
Well, I guess as the token red stater who does go to like his county GOP meeting, it's about 50-50 where I live in rural Texas when it comes to stuff like that. You'll have some boomers that are rather resigned, almost to a degree of learned helplessness, when they come to just sort of look at the news or the state of affairs with how things are going in Washington. And they're oddly optimistic about, things that they can do in Austin or on the city council or county commissioners. But then you have the other half that are like, well, we know what happened, but what can we do about it? And so there's a resignation in two forums. And I think that it's important that when we talk about, say, doing things in real life, what exactly that means. I think that it's important for us to maybe say that this isn't always just going to be political. Like, politics should never be 100% 24/7 of your life at all. Don't make an idol out of the latest political hot take. But it does really make a sign of things that the state or the regime, or however you want to call it, can organize armed Antifa people to defend a drag queen story hour in red states like Idaho, or even here in Texas. Although the cities are just as bad as some parts of the coasts, but neither here nor there. I think that you're absolutely right that this is going to be generational, because there's a lot of younger people that are finally kind of wanting to get their chance behind the wheel politically. But at the same time, I think that everyone is kind of watching this society of spectacle, whether it's over the latest political outrage or the fact that we're witnessing, basically a generation of young men and women be either pimping themselves out or, being the latest John online.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's a little bit this spectacle-based culture is kind of destructive. I don't know how to react to this. Please don't stop. I mean, this is what we're experiencing across all generations, can probably be pretty succinctly summarized as learned helplessness. Again, I don't know how you break out of that. I guess by having sort of small victories. Everyone who's suffered from depression during their lives, which I certainly have, knows what it feels like to be in a state of learned helplessness. That's kind of succinctly, psychologically, a very, very good analogy to what depression is. And it seems like the Zoomer generations are in this state of learned helplessness. And then subsequently, their parents are as well. A little bit of a different one, but still, I mean, they organize their lives around sort of not being hit, not getting injured. Everything we do, seems to me, has to counter signal that impulse of, I won't live my life because I don't want to get hit. I won't defend my faith or my people because I don't want to get hit. I don't know. I mean, why not take a hit or two? That's my philosophy at this stage. I really don't. I would take a hit to feel alive at this stage. It's the stagnation that I think is the biggest drag on my soul, and I don't know how to teach people to want that. I can tell that it's being sort of taken from us. This vivacity, this anxiousness for the fray that characterizes, in particular, Americans for quite a long time, has just been draining out of us in the last 3 years. And is it going to die right now in front of us, or is there going to be a nucleus that carries on?
So this is something that I can speak to, because this kind of extremely risk adverse behavior is something that is kind of typical of Gen Z. And there's a million different like ways you spin it. Like, oh, it was growing up during the financial crash, it was doing this, it was doing that. But in general, like, the trend seems to be that people my age are, by and large, more risk averse, right? So you see this in the amount of Zoomers who've decided to get their driver's license, right? Like a radical proportion of especially younger Zoomers refuse to get their driver's license. They don't want to drive anymore. They want to be driven.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain part of that might be laziness. There's a certain part that might be social contagion, but it speaks to this kind of like, and I find this too, because I will say, like, I call myself a Zoomer, but I don't share a lot of, common Zoomer touchstones, just because I lived in an area that I had dial up until I think I was 14 or 15, right? Which just cuts down the amount of culture you can directly receive, but nonetheless, there is this kind of trend that, like, by and large, kind of our youngest generation seems to be further along in that kind of like risk avoidance and kind of like, I don't know how to say dead, but to a certain extent kind of unwilling to take risks. And I think that a part of it with more, I guess, like more traditionally conservative groups, right? So people who are part of the young Republicans, who are traditionally religious, even though that they have these beliefs, there's this kind of yearning to go back to a time in which those beliefs were kind of cost free to hold. That being a traditional Christian, that being just more traditionally minded, was something you could do and still be a member of quote unquote polite society. And so, especially in kind of like the upper middle class and the middle class, right? Like the strivers, they've been pulled dramatically to the left, not necessarily by the things that normally pull people one way or another. So there hasn't really been a huge change in economics that it could account for it, at least in that way. But these people are so, I guess, enslaved to social approval, right? They're so enslaved to being thought of as good people that they've essentially been like forced dramatically to the left on certain social issues. And that admittedly has happened across different generations. But I do think it's particularly pronounced, on the internet, when you have, like the Black Square was a great example, this massive, like social pressure to conform. And I think that there's just a lot of people who don't want to admit or don't want to think about the fact that they might have to decide between their sincerely held, religious and cultural beliefs and being thought of as a good person by wider society.
I mean, just their ability to kind of have a soul. I mean, it just, for myself, blue American progressivism is just so soulless and stifling. I know people are feeling this. I talk to people who should have, by all rights, be progressive or would have signaled progressive things in the age of Jon Stewart. And now they just kind of exhibit a kind of nihilism, a kind of defeatism. These are ex-leftists. They don't have a hope for the future. They don't have some sort of animating spirit. And I don't know. I mean, would they probably would. I can't say what would eventually cure this, but it seems to me that if they kind of broke with the trajectory of their minds, and they would develop something that was more worth living for. It seemed to me that was something that maybe a distant perspective could give them. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. I get the sense always that I could talk to these people who are really dejected, and they might actually take a chance on new ideas. Maybe that's just fanciful on my part, but it certainly won't get them any status. It certainly won't get them any dopamine hits.
Reality at the current moment doesn't seem to offer a lot of reason to go on or to have a distinct interest in things. And, they always say that, reality can always red pill people. And instead, reality offers no alternative other than to just participate in the meat grinder or the soullessness, which is, I think, a really big problem. The other issue, I think, is that even before COVID, the online right always had a problem with irony. And I mean, it's extended it's even worse on the left, where the semi-ironic jokes about, suicide ideation and like, oh, a minor inconvenience might as well end everything is gotten demonstrably bad. But what's made it worse with COVID is that this is where my critique of, I guess, the online right comes in, is that we're really, really bad at, like what you said, just relishing or taking enjoyment of small wins or small victories, because you either are caught up in the knife fighting of this space where people are like, well, this is what it actually means, or here's like the latest, theory cell take of things, or, well, this isn't actually a victory because XYZ, when we are so deprived online of being able to enjoy ourselves or to look at the news events, and we have to provide commentary rather than to maybe either laugh at the absurdity or point people into a different direction. And I think that that's going to cause us from here, at least in the stake of this conversation, to direct people towards things that actually matter. Because Zoomers aren't driving as much. Game stores were killed during COVID. I mean, there are still a few people that are still do those things, which is good. Hobbies are gone. I mean, I can speak to it myself, because prior to COVID, I used to be a ridiculous pool player to a point where I paid for drinks when I went out. But now it's like, oh, well, if I want to think about it, my brain kind of goes like, well, do you really want to go out and drive and do all this thing? But, you have to kind of force yourself to do it. And I think that that's something that you kind of hit the nail on the head, Dave, is that a lot of people don't have the animating spirit.
Well, and one of the interesting things is that I kind of and this was even before I, had real like strong feelings on the disease in question, was just kind of too much of an ass to follow the rules. I was just like, whatever, the rules don't apply to me. I do what I want. And so weirdly enough, like my group of friends was kind of formed out of that. And it was basically, there was a huge fall off with people I used to know before, who either have never come out of the pod or are only now emerging, over the past couple of months from this kind of like, cocoon that they've made for themselves. And it's created this odd dynamic, because I was going through college during this, right? Where it feels like there are kind of two species of humans, There were the people who kind of kept on with life as normal as best they could, and then the people who've, gained, 30, 40 pounds, developed a, hardcore porn addiction, and won't shut up about like, weird progressive internet politics. And it's like, well, what the hell, man? Like, what happened to you? And so it does kind of seem like a weird, a bit of a watershed moment.
I feel kind of like the old fogey here, but I'm going to just talk about three things that my generation did back in the day. Because okay, so obviously super chats are on, and you can super chat me on the entropy link that's in the description, because I don't give money to Google, as everyone knows who watches this channel for the last year or so. But the most common question people ask me in super chat form, or generally, it usually revolves around meeting women, kind of establishing yourself as a guy. And okay, this is sort of what's getting to me right now about all you young Zoomers out there. And I'm glad I have J Burden, the Prudentialist, who I think is an honorary Zoomer if he's not one himself by his Star Wars designation, or Star Wars prequel fandom designation. Okay, so here's the thing. And I've been thinking about this a lot because people keep on asking it to me. But in my day, you walked into a pub, a brewery, because I was a hipster West Coast college student, and you always had a group of friends. And to kind of establish yourself as a guy in this group of friends, obviously girls don't have to do this because they just are, right? But to kind of establish yourself in this group of friends, you had to have kind of a few things. You had to have kind of what I call the thing you're known for. This guy, my thing was always like folk music. Like I did folk fiddle back in the day. I always had like a lot of knowledge about history and that kind of stuff, as you might tell. Even though I was an engineer, you always would have the story. This is another thing too that people expected you to have. When you were shooting the shit, people would tell the same like funny stories to each other, that things that actually happened to them, weird occurrences, and guys would kind of accumulate these things. And then you also would have to have kind of what I call like the plan or the scene. Like this is how I set things up for my friends. I'm going to plan like a ski trip or a party or a hiking trip, or come to this restaurant. That was always a great like pickup line. Like you always like had a restaurant that you took a girl to, and you'd pretend like you're a real regular there. And sometimes people would bribe the restaurant to pretend that they were regulars. So it's like the usual, like, they pretend like you really know them. And like, these are how you defined yourself socially. And yet for Zoomers, it's like all those things no longer exist. It's not their fault, obviously, because of COVID, but it's all profile now, it seems, virtually, right?
So I don't mean to make this into a pick me moment, but that all sounds familiar to me. And again, I don't want to put myself out as representative, because I live in like a relatively small town. I live in a very conservative area, and so like a lot of the destruction that happened during COVID kind of passed me by. Because I was around a large enough group of people who were essentially willing to kind of risk it, quote unquote. And so obviously in a diminished sense, just by numbers, but those forms kind of kept up, and they're still around. So you might be right, but at least in my experience, those all sound familiar to me.
Okay. So I'm optimistic. I mean, obviously, I want people to tell me that this is something that young people still kind of strive for. But I mean, what I was going to say is that all of those things you couldn't really develop without going outside of yourself, kind of being a social person in the real world. And I'm glad to hear that sort of maybe this is just a function of incredibly online people, but no, but I mean that's something that we did without for a few years. So maybe it's just a matter of rediscovering those things in a youth culture, if there is a youth culture.
I think the rules have been fundamentally rewritten, and I'm going to speak by pure happenstance of it just sort of being an anomaly. I moved to where I live like literally Christmas Day 2019, right before everything hit the fan. And I had gotten a remote job at the time before all of the COVID stuff hit, and then everything had happened. And at the same time, I had my own health issues with going to dialysis all the time for a year
Mhm.
during COVID. And so I come out of it, transplant. I go to my parish, discovering my religion and everything like that. And I'm like, well, the rules have been fundamentally rewritten because the usual places that I would think about going to are either closed down or it's really just older people going, and that there are digital substitutions for everything now, whether it's Discord or the heightened degree of parasocial relationships that people engage in. And for me, seeing people that are younger than me or even people my age sort of just accept the substitution, accept the paste instead of like the real food. I sort of had a cocked eyebrow looking around wondering, well, what the hell had just happened for the last 2 years? Because even though I was isolated, I had family, I had people to talk to, I could still visit churches and still ask questions. And it was bizarre to think that people I know online, because I get super chats kind of similar about, well, dating or relationship advice, which is always interesting because someone had once like replied in the comments. It's like, well, why does it that Prude and Dave always give like the worst dating advice? And it's like, because we're not overly online people and Dave's married. Like, what the hell? But
Well, you
I,
certainly you get a lot of it. That's the most common question, hands down.
well,
And,
yeah,
and
and
maybe I give advice that sucks, but it might be a generational mismatch,
well,
right?
and it may be, but what irks me about that question though is that I think it's indicative that the concept of the third place is gone, and that
Yeah.
regular hangouts or the usual doesn't happen. Do people like I had a Village Inn next to me in college where I would stay up all hours of the night either studying or just hanging out, and I'm like, I feel like those places are dead because people can stream video games or something. And that's why when I have conversations like these, I always tell people, when you turn the phone off at night before you go to bed, are you happy with the reflection you see of yourself behind the black screen? Because if you aren't, there are things that you can do, and you should maybe listen to people like myself or Dave or J Burden that might be able to point you in a direction. Because even though we have our own quirks or our own issues and flaws, like I like to think that the three of us in this conversation have remotely better IRL social lives than some of the people asking these questions. And that's not to ding them, but it's the fact that if they're asking for advice, there's clearly a much bigger problem that we're only getting a taste of.
The third place kind of strikes me as something that I thought a lot about when I was younger, but I don't know. As COVID killed it, I guess maybe.
Well, and I think that the other thing that has made it difficult is that in many ways, and this has been remarked upon by Ryan Turnipseed, and other kind of like Zoomers in our spheres, is that the formation of like Gen Z social circles is no longer like constrained by geography. So whereas before it would be like, oh, like I'm one of the guys who plays pool, so I go to the pool hall, and all my friends go there. Now it's like, oh, I'm a guy who's into, I don't know, pick something like like, oh, I'm super into like niche 90s Japanese sport compacts. And to me, my social circle is some like essentially like esoteric internet collection of people, right? And the problem with that is that when you get super specialized into something, and I have this because I quite regularly will, try to, talk with, guys my age. And a lot of times, like I can tell they're interested in something and I'm interested and I'm happy to let them tell me about it. But it's something so incredibly obscure and niche that I have almost no frame of reference for it,
Yeah.
and that there's a certain amount of connection you can build from being interested in someone. But in many ways, it's like, well, if there's no real like frame of reference, right? If this person's life is made up of a completely separate version of like, online social interactions of, a completely different group of cultural touchstones, it's like, well, what do we really have to talk about? And there are ways to get around it, right? Like I've always enjoyed talking to strangers, but nonetheless, I can see why it makes building social groups difficult because, like you said, the death of that third place, like people still have their third place, but it's not real in any like kind of physical sense.
It's Discord servers from what I say.
Yeah, it's what I've noticed a lot with younger people is that it's Discord servers or that they have a game night with Steam, whatever they've got loaded up with their Steam friends list and they'll play a game, which I mean, don't get me wrong, that's a lot of fun. I haven't totally forsaken video games because I think it's nice to have a pressure release valve every now and then from writing or recording or listening to your own voice when you're editing audio. But I find that we're really in a position to it's difficult because these things are gone, but it doesn't mean that they're dead completely. And I guess that means that we may have to attach these desires to have a life or a de-atomized life away from, just go out there and meet people and introduce yourself and shake your hand when most people I don't know do that nowadays. I mean, how do they interact with people in the real world anymore? Like I have the gift of gab and I don't mind striking up conversation with the cashier or whatever just to learn about how someone is, but I've noticed that there has been sort of this death of sociability. And I think that to bring that back, you have to attach that on already existing institutions that are still relatively pro-social, whether that be, in this instance, all three of us are religious, and I mean, we all go to our own churches. And I think that the parish has been a good example of this. I mean, the young men in my parish who are around my age or younger, they have a book club, once a month where they've got a list of everything ranging from ironically live not by lies to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so it's just like, well, they're on the right track. And I keep the frog goes away. I mean, when I'm in the real world, because no one knows IRL who I am, especially at church, except my priest. But it's I think an important thing for us to realize that these are separate lives and that people who engage in them, I think, Jay, you mentioned a really good word about species. I mean, we're kind of experiencing a political speciation where our social lives, our biology, our diets are fundamentally changing who we are as people, to where there are now like peer-reviewed papers saying that, when we did testosterone replacement therapy on liberals, they voted Republican. So I mean, we're clearly in a very new and strange world.
So can I ask a question for the panel?
Sure.
One of the things that I've experienced is that the number of things, and this is kind of like going off what you said, Prude, that are political signals are incredibly high compared to what it used to be, to the point where it's like your opinion on relatively innocuous things signal a lot about your life, and it can cause a lot of like discord in interpersonal groups, right? So I have some progressive friends who are from DC, right? And it's interesting because I genuinely do not ever bring up politics around them.
But you can't not, right? This is my story my entire life, right?
It's that other things will become signals for political discussions. So my fiance is, like many, women connected to our spheres, is really into kind of like naturalistic food, raw milk, things like that. And she mentioned, that when that she was looking for a raw milk share, which is a way to get raw milk in a state where it's illegal. And it brought the entire conversation to a halt. Like these people were mad at her. They were absolutely furious. Like, why would you do that? That's a bad thing. That's a conspiracy theory. That means you have bad opinions. And it was genuinely shocking, right? And I think that that's something that's always happened. But it seems to me that the number of those kind of like political trip minds dramatically increased over the pandemic, including, for instance, right? Like I'm completely off all normie social media. And that decision in itself is now like a political quote unquote decision.
But it feels so good, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. It's like that. Like I will quite regularly find out. It's like, oh, they got married and it's great. It's like, I had no idea they were even dating someone, but it's like, there's none of that like buildup of resentment, but that thing, which in, your personal life is very much a positive decision. Well, that's correlated with, well, why aren't you there? Why aren't you following important issues? Why aren't you a part of this? And that, I think that's very odd. And I don't know, maybe that isn't completely relevant, but it seems to me that the number of like political dog whistles has increased pretty dramatically. And that has made
it's really funny because the one you mentioned is raw milk. That was, I'm a kid of the late 90s, early 2000s. That was a shitlib signal back then. It's like the gas stove thing all over again. This is nuts, right? The signals are completely inverted. We're doing organic food can be a right-wing signal. I mean, this is I can't help but think that that there's sort of a light at the end of the tunnel here. I mean, if everything is political, then shouldn't we be able to de-atomize by simply being interested in the things that are organic and wholesome? We can't. Yeah, this is the thing, guys. I just I've kind of given up trying to do this obsec thing. I mean, obviously, I'm writing under a pseudonym for my online stuff, so people can't Google search my name. But I don't feel I can continue to do this, living a double life. I want my opinions, my status as a dissident, to be known to the people who are in my actual life, and probably, that already has involved losing the lion's share of my progressive friends. But it's you can't continually split your lives into pieces and hope that kind of something comes from that. My hope is that that sort of the signals pan out in a different direction. They'll go to the point where, okay, and did anyone remember the word gaydar from the 80s? Like there's this sort of a sensibility that gay men in particular had of noticing each other in a crowd. Would that ever occur to people who were of a distant persuasion? Because that just on opinion polls, that an enormous number of people are not going along with the mainstream society in their opinions. Any thoughts on that?
Well, this sort of reminds me of the Q&A session and from the event last year where we were talking about language and sort of identifying each other in the way. And it almost feels like nowadays you have to talk about politics with some kind of like right-wing polari where certain words or code signals just intrinsically mean, right wing. I'm in this Twitter group chat where they were talking about this and someone was like, oh, I'm at a diner. And someone said that they're a something enjoyer, and like enjoyer is like a right wing Twitter code word. And I'm just thinking to myself, what? That's good to know, right? Maybe that's the political signal I need to like keep my ear attuned for future signals. But
yeah, what if you just drop those things hard in a progressive circle? I
Hello,
want to know
friends.
as many. No, I'm serious. I want to know as many. The right level that you want to be at is you want to be at saying as many kind of obscure phrases that indicates that you're part of a dissident sphere, so to speak, but without giving anyone any ammunition or good reason to actually try to come after you in a meaningful way. That's the ideal volume you kind of want to be at in social environments.
I know what you mean, and it is kind of a difficult dance because on one hand, there have been times when it's kind of worked out well for me, but I over COVID met this collection of people, right? Kind of connected to a large evangelical university in my hometown. And there were people that I was genuinely, kind of, let's consider like acquaintances, right? People I'd spend time with, but not like anything particularly serious. And then I actually ended up getting in a relatively nasty one-sided argument, right? Something I thought was a discussion, but the other person, interpreted as an argument. With this kind of like extremely progressive woman, because I'd been talking to her husband, and her husband was an interesting guy. I'd read a lot of history, and I would consider him to be, he was a little bit older, right? To be kind of like a classic, lib, like he's basically like a Howard Zinn shit lib. But we had an interesting conversation about American history. And the conversation basically went around like, well, what is the story of America? Right. And basically my contention was like, whatever the story of America is, it is not principally just a tale of oppression, right? That is not the only thing to be said about America, and he was willing to kind of bandy that back and forth. And that discussion overheard, and I mean this sincerely, like I have relatively competent, social skills. I'm not a complete autist, so I was not trying to be deliberately provocative, but I ended up getting like kicked out of a party for it, like leave, like just get out. And again, like that's not the biggest deal, right? It was an acquaintance, but it was a situation that at least for me made me incredibly paranoid. But I think you're probably right that, and I know that Prude has done this, and also Lambda, Luke Avery has done this, that there definitely is something kind of like manly and meaningful in putting your face and name to your opinions that I think needs to be considered. And I say this as someone who is completely pseudonymous, right?
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, I think it depends on the stage of life you're at. At some point, you have to be thinking to yourself, "This is my life, and I don't want to put this off anymore." And if I'm going to get kicked out of a party for having milked his opinion, might as well get kicked out. It sounds like a great story. I don't. I mean, I kind of I don't know. I'm kind of curious to see what they're willing to throw down. I guess the one real kind of wild card here is your employer, because so much of our social interaction is mitigated through that.
I think you're right. And now that I'm looking back in it, I think that a large part of my paranoia comes from being in school during the George Floyd event. Because essentially, the American universities went hard for the BLM narrative. And looking back, I probably didn't need to be as scared as I was. But I do remember, and again, this is all anecdotes from my personal life, and I don't mean to, monopolize this stream.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember a very specific event when I think she was probably in her late 30s, early 40s, millennial teacher or professor, basically sat down in kind of like the height of, the George Floyd furor, and basically said, like, look, if you are a racist, I will refuse to teach you. I will make you leave. And again, that's one of those things. Like, did she mean it? Probably not. Like that was probably an emotional thing said, but nonetheless, I remember that atmosphere on campus, during the, the BLM and during the, like the culture war around COVID. And it did very much feel like if you were found out, it was, you were out. And again, look, that was probably perception. And I think that might have only been sustainable for a time. But I think that, and we can tie this back into something that Prude has said, and, my eternal topic of conversation, which is, I think that that's also the only time in which, Rod Dreher's Live Not by Lies could have seemed like a real book, if that makes sense.
Well, can you clarify that? Because
sorry. So Live Not by Lies is essentially, Dreher's, and it's written like many Dreher books, and like it's half history, half anecdotes,
half his European travelogue.
Yeah, exactly. Half Rod Dreher's travel blog, but a large portion of it chronicles essentially how Christians lived behind the Iron Curtain, right? So he talks about, there's this feeling that you were, constantly under surveillance, that you needed to hide your personal opinions, that, you needed to create or like curate a small group of, insiders who you could really share who you truly were, and then also kind of like hide your true beliefs from the outside. And I think that that's something that seemed like a plausible, real strategy at the height of like the 2020, 2021, like cultural war, right? Where it really did seem like, oh, if I'm seen to be out of step on COVID, or seen to be out of step on, BLM, that could be, like a career ender. Whereas I think now, and I'm kind of, slowly coming around to what you brought up, it does kind of seem like that was a little bit of that kind of level of intensity was unsustainable. And I think that things have calmed down. So that was my point.
Yeah. And it's good. I get the sense that we're in the middle of a sea change in culture, and I can't imagine. Well, I certainly can't imagine that we're just going to resign for life and bury ourselves. I know an enormous percentage of the population is going to do just that, but for me, the urge to kind of live more and more a unified life and less a divided one it's just a constant fixture. Sorry, not constant picture. It's sort of this nagging thing in my own mind. I just don't want to maintain a double life. I can't as a parent. And again, I don't want to have my blog appear on Google searches my name. But short of that, I don't want to be maintaining some kind of illusion or double speak. I want to be in my expressions publicly, in writing or blogging or vlogging or talking to you like I am right now, as much the same person as I am if you were to meet me on the street, or if we were to meet at some hobby activity or whatnot. And I don't know. I think that, to me, that's life. To me, that is de-atomization. And that's the only way we can really build something. I mean, the basket weaving is a huge start. For me, the problem with basket weaving is that it's very much organized around a British model where the population densities are a lot higher. We're doing good work with it, but the problem is that this is America. Not everyone's within driving distance or within a weekend trip. And the density of people who are kind of meeting as ideological allies has got to get much, much, much higher before this thing starts working in the same way. But for me, that's sort of the hope of kind of coming up with a better way to live post 2023.
I have a wild sense of optimism for, I guess, the side of things in real life in the years ahead. And I'm not speaking about political activism, but more so for the fact that we've witnessed the last 2.5 years the abject destruction of friendships, interpersonal life, our daily routines have been upended. Social quirks and quips have changed for a lot of people, although for most, they kind of saw through the BS rather quickly, and good on those that did. I think that you're right. I mean, America geographically makes basket weaving difficult. I basket weave with maybe one or two people on a regular basis that I know in like the DFW area. But like,
Yeah.
I think it's really, I think that I have this optimism because I see what people are showing off. People aren't talking about, oh, did you see this person's live stream or essay or that they put out, which I mean, that still happens, but people are excited about in conversations and chats and tweets about going out to dinner with their wife and kids, or or about getting married or meeting with friends or starting a club for books or 40K or whatever. Like all these things that we, somewhat, lost in these last 2 years. There's optimism about wanting to resettle, to come back to the land and to rebuild since the storm washed everything away, almost as if that hurricane meant nothing and the Floridians are ready to recover when the next one hits. And I think that that's sort of the attitude that I see coming into this, because more people are excited to share about their life. And even parasocially, right? One of my favorite people that super chats you almost every week, Dave, is the guy that gives his dating romance life update, because for some reason,
yeah, he's super chatted here too, so you'll get this.
Fantastic. He's one of my favorite people because it's a sign that he's going out and he's living his life and he's like reporting about it.
Yeah,
I don't care that people find that cringe. I think that it's good that people are like, hey, I went out. This is what my life was like. And I think that we need to show that to people, that, hey, we can have regular conversations and things like this out in the open and not have a problem. And to my one last little sort of personal anecdote is that that's what I do every week with a friend from church, is that we just go out and we'll break our fasts on Wednesdays, and we'll go to a Panera Bread of all places, but we'll have a very open sort of conversation about faith, life, whatever we're reading, in a place that's sort of kind of known to be rather a feminine or sort of like shit lib environment. But it's just like, yeah, we're going to talk about St. Maximus the Confessor, or like out in public for an hour and a half or whatever we're reading, in this like little Panera Bread eating soup or whatever. Like that works for us. And I think that kind of attitude needs to carry forward. And I think that when people get to talk about their real life more, or what they're excited about, it can show examples of what progress looks like. I do have a sense of optimism that it really does take us to start living our lives and setting the right examples for people.
Yeah, I had this experience. My wife's been gone, so I walked into a Panera Bread for the first time in like 5 years since my son was born, and I ordered a salad, and it cost me $10. No, it cost me it cost more than that. It cost like 15. It was some insane amount of money, and I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to like not order it.
Lord have mercy.
Because that would have been kind of embarrassing, but I couldn't quite believe it. But no. I think you have the right idea. I always, to list every millennial's favorite movie, I always think of Fight Club, where the Tyler Durden character gives all of the people who come to Fight Club little homework assignments, like go out, start a fight, and lose. And that's kind of what I want to impart to most people who listen to this channel. Go out and see if you can't get into some kind of uncomfortable human interaction, and see where that takes you. Just see where it takes you. Just do something you haven't done before and see if you get closer or further away to the place where you want to be. I always think, and this is a really great idea that millennial woes had. I think it's not necessarily well suited for somebody in their 40s, but it's to kind of, what would it be to hitchhike across the country post COVID and see where the country is at? What kind of interesting things would you see? What would you observe? What would you be able to kind of take stock of? What experiences would you get? How would what you experience in the real world differ from what you see through sort of the mirror of social media, as you put it, Prudentialist?
I would love to see what that would look like. Although I think if I'm going to hitchhike or drive across the country, I'd stay strapped in some places. But earlier this last year in the late summer, I actually did drive at least through the South. I went to Georgia for a few days to see somebody, and it was just nice to sort of take my time. I mean, it's like a 14-hour or so drive or whatever, but to I made it longer just to stop and talk to people and see how things were. And I made it a point to always talk to the people running the gas stations, because the guys that run those things have seen everything day in and day out, and they kind of just tell me what things are like. And they say that things are a lot more empty, that the crazies really do come out more at night nowadays, but there's still people that want to do things. And there are more. I saw a lot of bed and breakfasts opening up, which I thought was interesting. And that there was a renewed interest in the outdoors, that there was a lot of websites and a lot of traffic about national parks and RVs, which, I mean, there was a big run on RVs and campers during COVID, but now people are really taking advantage of them in ways that they can really enjoy it. And I was really surprised to see that a lot of that sort of culture of wanting to enjoy the outdoors and to, call people up and say, hey, we're going to go hiking this weekend. I was quite pleased to see that, at least, cutting through Mississippi, Alabama, and getting to Georgia, that all of that was available. And so I guess that the South seems to have something going for it, but I can't speak to the rest. But I would like to visit, the Midwest or New York one of these days.
My dream for the basket weaving project is that a young person living in the suburbs of LA should be able to hitchhike to Boston, Massachusetts, and completely weave his entire way through it in terms of couch surfing and support. That would be just an absolute dream, I think. And I think that are we that far away from that kind of thing being a possibility? I don't want to bring up millennial woes continuously, but there was this kind of, he did this documentation of a journey throughout the United States. And this was sort of, it was weird because at the time I kind of was making a video against sort of his political movement. But I was still very interested in his story, kind of experiencing America as an outsider. But blogging aside, it's those experiences, like your trip across the South, that I want to hear from people. And more, I think there's a hunger to kind of make part of our lives more properly. J Burden, I see you're being called out by Charlemagne on Telegram. He says he's going to take a shot every time you say. I completely agree with that.
Oh, so this is that's a good point. This is the core of my deep insecurity about becoming the E-Right's Dave Rubin, who just agrees with everything. But point taken. I'll put it that way.
No, it's good. I actually like that. It's all right to say things continuously as long as you're aware of it. For myself, it was always the word functionally. I love that word and I use it way too much. But yeah. All right, guys. Well, we're at an hour. What are your guys' general thoughts on what 2023 has in store for us? This is going to be the last sort of low watermark year before the next election cycle starts up again. J Burden, I know you've been on the record, and I think I agree with you that as far as American political dynamics go, they're just going to win parties. They're going to white knuckle it throughout for all elections going forward. and we're going to basically have a functionally one-party state. But I'm interested to see what your guys think might be coming up in the next year. Any takers?
Sure, I'll take it again. I think that 2023 for the year going forward, I think it'll be make or break for a lot of people that either start businesses or that will organize, because I think that things are pending some miraculous major stress test on the regime. It's been pretty darn resilient. I mean, even though the specter of Trump haunts it, it managed to survive that administration, fortify him out of it, and to, bring in whatever they needed to for today. And that, I think, for just having a friend network and having people that they can rely on is going to be really important. I think that we have some of the sort of proto resources there. I think that findmyfriends.net is very good, because we know that we've had colleagues or fellow travelers that have had their link trees, banned off and things like that, which is good. But that also has to transcend from the digital into the real. And I like what your optimistic hope is that some guy in Los Angeles can make his way to Boston by just, couch surfing with other dissident friends. I think that that's going to be helpful, because we all have different know-hows and experiences based off our jobs, our geography, and what we do for fun, or what we just do to work around the house or the land. And I think that those kind of skill sets we need to start transferring more. And if that means that our content in 2023 becomes less theoretical or less, things I read in a book or a blog that I found was interesting, and more about, well, here are the experiences I learned, cutting my hand open while building a chicken coop, then so be it, right? That's a good thing. And maybe I should, write that story down. But
yeah, you should. It certainly will beat the stuffing out of my 6,000 word essay I just penned on esoteric monarchism. So,
I just spent 2 hours today, trying to edit audio and breaths and clicks and things for a video that comes out tomorrow. So maybe I should write that story. But I think that 2023 has to be the year where we finally break out. I mean, we had so much optimism last February from the US event. I mean, that led to the Old Glory Club, and that leading to future plans for mutual aid and for meetups and things like that. That has to continue. But I just see that, when even the European Central Bank, like Christine Lagarde, is yeah, we're going to have a recession, sort of the cat's out of the bag, and things are going to get really bad. And I think having a friend network that can either call you or be within driving distance to help you out with something is going to happen more than ever. I know you, Jay Burden, had been helping an old teacher friend redo their floors. I feel like that's stuff that we need to have more of now more than ever.
Yeah. So what I would say is that, to me, as someone who's been kind of an odd, transitional period in my life, at the same time that this massive, social upheaval is happening, is that there are certain things that you can only learn from essentially just doing it and giving it a shot. And, especially being on the internet and being, let's just say neurodivergent, it's very easy to get into kind of eternal analysis mode. But there are certain things, helping someone with their house, helping a friend who needs to move, because they got fired for online politics or anything like that, that is something that you kind of can't reason your way into, so much like faith, you essentially just have to do it. You can't really talk yourself into it. You can't just think about it all day. It just has to be done. That I think that there are a lot of things that, and a lot of, I guess, great experience to be had in essentially just giving something a shot. And there is undoubtedly some risk in that. And I've been thinking, Dave, about what you've been saying about, OPSEC and all that. And I find myself, being drawn to that. I stopped myself from saying I agree. But but there is an element to it. It's well, okay, there's no risk-free path out of this. So you're going to have to assume risk to do anything here. And that might be a very small risk of being I was an ass, I wasn't, the most smooth in that social interaction. I made a fool of myself. Everyone thinks I'm weird, especially when you're approaching people out in public. That can definitely happen. But I think that we are in a position in which there's no truly safe option. You're going to have to jump. And the question is just, well, where do you jump to? And so I guess like getting comfortable with risk and getting comfortable with kind of, you know, assuming a certain level of like probable failure, I think is something that's going to be necessary. And that's more of an interpersonal thing. But I think we'll probably see the same thing in politics, where in order to get out of the stage we're in, we're going to have to become more embodied and more real. And with that will come a certain degree of exposure. And I know that's already happened with, you know, the old Glory Club stuff, for instance, right? There is a level of risk associated with forming an institution.
Mhm.
And so I think that's going to be a scary thing, especially when it seems like, you know, the regime is kind of hell bent on like white knuckling, you know, their control on power, but it's nonetheless something we're going to have to do.
Yeah, and this is, I would say that basket weaving has to go up about one order of magnitude before it sort of becomes autonomous, which is actually very doable, I think, post COVID, especially if everyone plays into the same network. I've been thinking about ways to expand that, and if I have to be the one person who is like, this is what I always kind of don't like about the constant label shifting. If I were to come out and go like, put up a flyer going like, "Are you interested in blank ideas? Just hop on this Discord server, say hello to us," or something like that. Uh, what would you? How would you signal that? What would you call yourself to broadcast that you're not a progressive, you're not a Republican, and that you're interested in sort of the distant perspectives that we talk about frequently here? And I guarantee it, no matter what name you think of, people will hate it in a year. But still, it's something that I kind of want, because I do feel like I'm at the point in my life where the facade can't really be maintained comfortably. And we just have to kind of see what comes of actually living with yourself in the real world as you project it online. Anyway, guys, I get the sense that we're winding down a little bit. Maybe I'll read a few super chats and see if we can't inspire some conversations here. I know that I can project things from Entropy onto StreamYard, so I'll just read them if you guys don't mind. But Prudentialist, you'll be happy to know that Ben White has given me 2 super chats. The first one says, "Hi, Prude. I know that you drive quite a distance to attend Orthodox liturgy. I also drive a long distance for Latin Mass, since there are only 2 TLM churches in my city. Do you see such a spread out on low density communities as a bad thing?"
Yes, I do. So I drive about 30 minutes to go to my parish, and we're all kind of geographically separate. Our parish is like one of the several mission parishes of like the OCA here in Texas, and we're all kind of like geographically disparate because that's the nature of how things are, and it certainly is a pain. But one of the challenges that we've had to face, that started last fall, was that our priest had to move. Him and his wife and kids, they managed to get a new home elsewhere, and they're now serving in a different part of the state. And we've been sort of struggling without a full-time priest where we're at. We've had visiting priests come in and out. And one of the things that we've really learned to focus on is taking what we know and ingratiating ourselves not just inside of church service but also communities. So this means meeting for dinners at someone's place for feast days, or making sure that those who are sick have been, are taken care of. I try not to, tell too much about my life in that regard, but like I have my iconography teacher, it was battling cancer this summer, and I took care of her and her elderly mom while she was in the hospital and things like that. I mean, you really have to invest your time to do so, because if you're all just geographically disparate and you just, see each other once or twice or 3 times a week, then that's it. Then, that's a great way for the parish to kind of die. You really do have to invest a lot of your time and effort into it, especially if it's that geographically disparate.
Yeah, and I think this is something that basket weaving can aspire to when it's again, like I said, when it's one order of magnitude larger than it is right now, 10 times larger, which again, I don't think that's pie in the sky. I think that's going to naturally occur in the next 2 years. But the thing that people have to right now what we do essentially is meet up usually and get drinks or do sort of special events like say Handel's Messiah or something like that. A little less frequently than I'd like, but that's kind of what the groups usually do as I've seen them. But what really is the utility of having a place like the Basket Weavers is you arrive in a new area and you want to know what's the best church to go to in this area for my spiritual needs. I remember when I first converted as a Catholic, I was living in Portland, Oregon, and I went to like the cathedral because this is the biggest Catholic building. I was very early in my conversion process. Obviously Catholicism wasn't exactly a foreign creed. It was the faith of my grandparents, but I was feeling things out and I had to sit through a countless number of, everyone knows what kind of urban cathedral sermons are like. They're kind of the shitlib Catholic version with the most milquetoast, with the most milquetoast liturgy and homilies you can imagine. And I wasn't aware until later when I moved to Seattle that there was a nearby parish to me that would have been way more aligned with my theological beliefs and was way more active with way more young people. And it had just been under my nose for the entire. How would I have heard about it? No one was going to forward me away from the parish that I currently was at. So they're just all of these little living tips that people can pick up with people who are local to them. I don't know. We need to establish a portal from the online space to the real world in that regard. One more thing from Ben White before I finish with his super chats. True enough, Prudentialist, he has more dating updates.
Let's go.
I was at a local restaurant with a couple of my buddies. At the next table were 4 or 5 attractive blonde girls, all looking on their phones, hardly talking to each other. I'm thinking that the more attractive a girl is, the less personality she has. Well, I think my wife would certainly agree about blondes, but because she's a brunette. But I don't know. J Burden, do you have any opinions about attractiveness being inversely correlated with personality? I know you're engaged, so you probably can answer that.
No. I'll go ahead. Here's what I'll say.
Brave man.
There is a level of attractiveness at which women become aware that they are attractive, and at that point, they're essentially ruined. Because basically, I've seen this happen. Right. And this doesn't mean, you should date someone you're physically repulsed by, but it does mean that in many cases, what is attractive if it's attractive to you instantaneously on social media, 300 other guys are thinking the exact same thing. And that person or that woman has been bombarded with male attention. And essentially that means that you are always replaceable. And I don't mean to sound like a PUA, like a manosphere guy, because that's not my crowd at all. But I am just saying that extremely attractive women, especially with like mainstream social media platforms, the big following, it kind of ruins their brain. It's basically like the female version of porn. It provides that same like dopamine hit.
Yeah, Profilicity is the female version of porn.
100%. And honestly, it's one of those things where it's like I would stay away, like large social media following, lots of male attention, like maybe it'll work out for you, but I almost guarantee you it won't. So I would agree with that.
I kind of kicked up a minor fight with manosphere people the other week, a few weeks ago, when I said the only way we're going to get out of this woman problem is for people to understand the real utility of celibacy. Celibacy is power because from a celibate position, you can tell women that their attractiveness is not an asset beyond what you'd grant them minimally as a friend. And we just have to collectively shut that door for the fair sex so they can find themselves. It's like you have to shut the door in your own mind with these sort of pornographic promises of endlessly available bodies. What do you say, J Burden? Stacked genitalia in whatever arrangement you like.
Yeah, which is a line I completely stole from Alex Kashuda, but it's a good one.
Well, one up and coming interview show stealing from another. Nothing wrong with that, right? Anyway, let me go on for the other super chats. I think there's more than a few of them. And guys, if you want to super chat any of the guests, the link is, I believe, pinned in the live stream. Yeah, it's pinned above the live stream if you want to hop on to Entropy. Anyway, yeah, Entropy is a good service. I support it as alt tech. People still use that phrase anymore. Anyway, Chad Pilgrim says for $5 USA. Hey Dave, Academic Agent has brought up Shrek's message of the beauty within being deeply subversive, as opposed to physiognomy and the older fairy tales that the movie parodies. He also points this subversion of Christianity. The last will be first. Any thoughts? Well, I mean, despite the fact that you're referencing the sort of white whale of my entire channel, if you're not aware of this, J Burden, I recorded half of a video about Shrek the week before my child was born. And as you can imagine, you know how you're never, so you don't know this, but everybody who has children knows that you're never quite the same person after you have kids as you do before. So I have this hopelessly unfinished project where I'm trying to summon the thoughts that I had when I was making this video like 3 years ago. But I'll answer the actual question since it's addressed to me. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the physiognomy is a thing. And I think that there's a classic wisdom that the twisted exterior tends to correlate with the twisted interior. But that's not a hard and fast rule. I mean, the just lepers of the Gospels that you can hear about, and a lot of these things, like these digs about Christianity, the problem is that they're at the level of scriptural unsubtlety that like I can't take seriously. I mean, we can talk about we can read the first will be last and the last will be first, and we can make Jesus a communist. But I mean, I remember refuting that when cringe progressives threw that in my face. Do I need to like reassert this from the right, or when the critique is brought to me from my right wing? I don't know. I guess this is sort of a continuous conversation we're having. I associate this kind of conversation most with the neo-pagans. The problem is that I don't think these attacks on Christianity being weak hold very much water when you kind of disengage them from their straw men. And so I don't know. I guess you could say like, well, a straw man version of Christianity is just meek, simpering sycophancy to the throne of power and an appeal to weakness in the pursuit of bio-Leninism. But that is not in keeping with Christianity's history. It's not in keeping with Christian orthodoxy. And this heresy has been called out many times in Christianity's history. So I don't know. I mean, what do you? It's hard to know really what the other side of this conversation is. That isn't just sort of an own that sounds good in 288 characters but can't survive extended analysis.
So one of the things, and this is not a finished thought, so don't jump down my throat on this, but
it's a live stream. There aren't any finished thoughts.
Yeah,
here.
Fair enough, right? Which is why I never do recorded videos. But nonetheless, there is something to be said for. I feel like there's a spectrum between how much culture affects the church and how much the church is affected by culture. Where there you can say, well, like, okay, this society was Christianized, and okay, there was a difference. But there is always this kind of synthesis between, culture and Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the examples I always notice is like the difference between kind of like cringe boomers trying to incorporate things like liturgical dance into a service. And then when you see African churches do it.
Yeah.
And one of these is, okay, it's not my culture, but it seems to be genuinely joyous, right? Or in another context, it's like, well, okay, this is just cringe and embarrassing. Like this is just adults making fools of themselves. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, well, both of these things are Christian, but there is a layer of culture to it as well, right? And I understand that there is and this is why I have a hard time with, Christian nationalists. And maybe this is sacrilegious, but I'm not entirely convinced by the argument that the only thing separating us from our forefathers is a direct, I guess, decrease in religiosity. I think that there are a lot of things all at once that contribute to each other. And I don't know, maybe that's a horribly unorganized point, but it is something I kind of continually wrestle with.
No, man, that's a good point. I mean, the sort of pagan inclinations you hear from people like academic agents, he's not wrong reacting against the other pitiful state of Christian leadership in the West. It's just, it's hard to fathom. It's hard to fathom how out of touch they are. It's hard to fathom how they don't know what time it is. And even the people who say they know what time it is don't know what time it is. And yeah, I sympathize with their emotions, but this is not an intellectual controversy as far as I can tell.
Yeah, taking something out of one line in regards to the parable of what the kingdom of heaven is like in Matthew 20 is, I appreciate the attempt at scriptural exegesis and trying to apply it to today's political commentary to something that is not of this earth. But there's definitely, you have a point there about the sad state of Christian leadership, because I guess when you're looking at mainstream, especially here in America, which is, sort of this broad spectrum evangelical or, Christianity, where it's just, there are so many people that will speak on behalf of others, and these people don't even have their wedding garment. And of course, people are going to look at that and be rather dissatisfied with what their answer is going to be about the current culture, which is blatantly heretical and anti-Christian to begin with, especially nowadays. And I sympathize with AA's point, but, I pray for him nonetheless.
Well, I mean, this is a problem with contemporary religion, is that it's struggling to find an easy answer. When I was living in Seattle, actually before I kind of lived there properly, I remember encountering this church, Mars Hill Church, which is founded by this guy called Mark Driscoll, and he was obsessed with masculinity, and it was kind of, I wasn't really, to me, being kind of a cringe atheist back then, I kind of didn't understand why it was transparently cringe how this guy treated masculinity. Later, I realized that he was probably reacting to a market effeminacy in American Christianity. But what resulted was kind of this very, very desperate, I don't want to be like the other guy, so I'm going to be cringe in the opposite direction type deal. And to me, it's sort of this wild, bouncing off the sides of walls, trying to get away from a modern problem that creates, it creates the problem of the modern world, where it seems that a person has no constancy and it doesn't have any kind of gravity to their beliefs. And I think about that example all the time when I think about the problems of when I hear sort of the critiques that come out of the Baptisphere or whatever. All right, I'm going to move on here. Oh, go ahead. Did you have something to say?
So this is actually something that I think is also illustrated in the case of the gas stoves, right?
Yeah.
Where it seems like the left has kind of realized that they can essentially make the right adopt whatever position they want, and then kind of like use that as a stick to beat them, and the right kind of willingly plays into this because there's a lot of clout to be gained from being the first one to dunk on the libs, or to dunk on the libs the best. But I think one of the problems with that is that you are being positioned by your enemy, just kind of in a negative way. And to me, I can't remember her name, but there was some kind of like awful, like alt-right type grifter, during like 2018 or 2019. And this was at the start of the bathroom discussion. And the person on the newscast basically said, well, you can't expect, trans people to go to bathroom in the bushes. And she said, well, hell yes, we can. We want trans people in the bushes, taking a dump like animals. And that's one of those things where it's like, well, okay, like I guess that's based, you can post the Giga Chad, but you do realize that makes you look like a moron, and I guarantee you that was one of those things where this rake was placed out in front of her by her opponent. And she was like, just lining up, like just jump on it, smack yourself in the face with it. And sure thing, she looked right dead in the camera and did it. And I think that much like the Mars Hill guy, that's an instinct we have to kind of root out on
No,
our.
I'm really glad that you mentioned this, because the gas stoves is the perfect example of, like, what is the right wing really good at online? Like, the right wing online is really good at meme culture. We own it. And I think that, as Zero HP Lovecraft said, it's also a really good sign of how powerless that we are. Because you can make memes and dunk on the libs, but all that you're using is an ecosystem that encourages the hotter and hotter take, or the edgier and edgier meme, to be used as a representation by the regime to later, like, be in some document about radicalization online. And the meme culture is great, but I think that it's a great way to be the petard that we get hoisted on in the end of the day, whether it's about Christianity or about gas stoves.
What was the rake of gas stoves, though? I mean, maybe I fell for the bait here, Jay Burden, but
Well,
I felt like this was a gift to me. That's just an indication that I literally stepped on the rake.
No,
but
I was
about to say, like, gas stoves, your arsenal gratefully accepted.
It's the same reactive tendency, but to a more useful end. I think that the most recent example of a rake set out was the COVID amnesty discussion.
Yeah. For sure.
I kind of view that as a way to keep people who are thinking about defecting, quote unquote, in line. So maybe this isn't the ironclad rule that I'd set out, but I do think it is a general trend to to avoid.
Good point. I'm getting behind in myself, so I'm going to keep on going. On to Cringe Walker. Okay, Cringe Walker for $3 USA. All the dog whistles are essentially the regime developing antibodies against anyone not in sync with its central domain, which, by the way, this system of government is impossible without big tech. Big thonk. So he's saying that the dog whistles are, life is impossible without big tech. We control big tech. Therefore, you have to do what we say at all times. I mean, I think that's definitely the message. That's going to be the message going forward. We control the switches on the microchips. Do what we say. With increasingly little justification in the middle. Any thoughts on that?
Jay, do you want to take this one?
I guess I don't have anything like particularly insightful to add, so you can take it.
Oh, okay.
We won't have to. I mean, Cringe Walker is a regular here. We don't have to necessarily write an essay.
Actually,
I think that's
what I should say on this, because
Sure.
I've actually canceled streams with Cringe Walker 2 nights in a row. And so this is a formal in public apology for canceling on Cringe Walker, not once but twice. So I guess that's my comment on it, that I'm a shitty streamer.
I think that there's a lot to say, though, about. I mean, a lot of these things can be flexes, because how did this thing started? Because someone, I think the Consumer Product Safety Commission had made a remark about saying that they were looking into it. And then people reacted. There were 2 Washington Post stories that immediately came out that were lamenting conservatives inserting gas stoves into the culture war. And then someone said that they weren't doing it. And then a day later, they had said, actually, no, we are looking into the impact of gas stoves. And it was the only time I've ever seen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez invoke IQ and cognitive function, talking about exposure to NO2, the gas, in regards. And so, to me, I think it's a sign that, yes, there are things about control, and it's ways of closing off the exits, in the same way that, I haven't seen anyone jailbreak a Tesla yet, where you have to pay extra features as a subscription service for heated seats or whatever. And I can't wait for someone's car to get, repoed, and the pilot assist driving takes it out of your driveway and puts it on some tow truck and carries it away. I find this increasing grid reliance, which most of our power grids can't handle anymore, or at least Texas's can't. So yeah, I think that this is an interesting time frame where they're looking at ways to control, but also to manage resources, because they know that they can't give this many people the quality of life that the quote unquote American dream's about.
All right, I'm going to go on here. American Covidiot. I love that name. Hi, guys. American City's orientation towards the car creates a city of stroads with no town squares or central hangout spaces. The dissident right has a real opportunity to approach cities differently than atomized, deracinated car suburbs. Well, this is interesting. I kind of live in a shitlib suburb myself. So anyone want to take this about the decline of the American public square?
So yeah, there are several things, which is that there is something to be said for the fact that cars became for much of the 20th century kind of like the cornerstone of the economy, and so cars were pushed, right? In my own small town, we had streetcars up until about 100 years ago, and they were public transportation, right? And they were essentially ripped up because a local chain of dealerships lobbied the state government or the municipal government. So that's true. But I think there's also something to be said for the fact that in the post-civil rights era, many kind of like middle class, white Americans didn't want to live in urban areas anymore for a variety of reasons. And there was this kind of like push and pull of, on one hand, the government, in subsidizing, the automotive industry, either directly or indirectly, pushing the suburbs as a a positive good. And then also kind of the downfall of American cities into kind of these like, more dangerous places. And so there's a certain part of it that's like, yes, I get all of these complaints, but I also don't particularly understand how, without solving any one of those issues, we really get around that, because look, like I'm lucky enough to live in a place where I can, walk to church, but in a place as big as America, I don't really understand how we get around, our dependency on cars.
Geographically, I don't know how you do, but at the same time, maybe the work from home thing has, because in Texas, it's been this interesting thing where people have fled California and have come to Texas and other places to come here. And they want to work in these big tech city jobs. And some of them are work from home. But the housing market in like the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex is ridiculous. So they'll climb out and go westward, eastward, and northward up, I-35 or I-75, buying up every tract of land that they can, which means more projects to increase the lanes on the road, which, I mean, if anyone who's ever driven through like, Dallas Fort Worth, that it is the Jenga tower in reverse of like, well, maybe if we add just one more lane, traffic congestion will be resolved. It never has been, never will be. The infrastructure is designed for like a city population of like 250,000 less. So maybe your billions must fry thing can be a meme there. But what irks me is that we don't have that many. I don't know how many dissident right city planners there are, or civil engineers. Like, I mean, there's Clossington that I know of, but unless we're controlling the zoning board, I don't know how much of this is a great opportunity, other than to say that like we should definitely reappropriate the walkable cities meme from the left and maybe not make it the Steve Saylor reply guy stats.
I know that this is sort of city planning has been the whipping boy of all American social problems for the last 60 years. I for one, kind of count me as a skeptic of the city planning controls our social destiny. I think that's kind of like the Jared Diamond guns, germs, and steel equivalent. So that's the guns, germs, and steel story of American urban decline, the political crack cover story. I think that if you were a dissident right group, if you had one good like regular place where everyone like a bar or a brewer where people felt comfortable in within a 50-mile radius periodically, you'd be set for our problems in the short term. I don't know. It's worth considering, but I should go on here. The next super chat is for Cringe Walker again, $3 USA. Also, piece of advice. Now the regime loyalty is so hyper specified. If you really want something, even in the outer limits of trad, you just have to look for someone unable to repeat the current thing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that kind of gets to what we were saying about language maybe working in our favor just by subtraction. The fact that we're not signaling along all of the right memes means that we stand out like a sore thumb.
Well, and actually, and I know I've mentioned this several times already, but I feel like the black square on social media, during the summer of Floyd was an interesting example, because obviously where it was 1 minute socially progressive and another minute, Whitey trying to be socially progressive, which of course is the worst thing possible. The people who didn't go along with it was actually a pretty good directory, for who was at least willing to hear you out. And so very much, I think that almost by looking at the negative space, so to speak, right? Looking at not necessarily who says what you think, but who won't say what they think, I think is a very good way of kind of like, scoping out potential friends.
I've long thought that this might be a vector we could explore with the pronoun pins and the pronouns in the bio that the modern companies force you to fill out or ask you to fill out. If people could just come up with a common phrase to put there that would indicate they don't agree with it, but doesn't subvert the frame of pronouns, you could kind of implicitly organize yourself that way. For instance, I always felt like writing ut vides in the pronoun, like as you see it.
It will almost,
and so then you're kind of labeled with this thing that is, you translate it and it's unoffensive, but it also tells that you're not really complying or that you have an opinion that is technically thought crime.
That's an interesting idea. I like that. I'll take that down as a note because I want to actually explore that.
Well, I remember when a lot of the bigger culture wars started around like 2016, especially with the election. Everyone had to say something about Trump's remarks or whatever, and they said that the time for being apolitical is over. You have to stand somewhere. And I've always noticed that you can usually, have a good nose for seeing who stays silent or who kind of like rolls their eyes in meetings or things like that. And that's always been my way of sniffing out people. It's just been like, oh, they're quiet during like the annual diversity woke BS that's company training that's required here. Like, oh, okay, that guy's probably someone I could talk to and not get my ass sent to HR.
All good ideas, but I need to go on because we're, as usual, my stream's going to be pushing the time here. Bartholomew the Red for $5 Canadian. Hey, Dave, Prude, J Burden. Hard agree on the de-atomization and the importance of IRL contacts. I just get jealous when I listen to Americans talking about all the opportunities they have for basket weaving. In Canada, there's none from what I can see. Yeah, I've heard it's a little harder in Canada. I'm not going to tell you that basket weaving opportunities are super thick on the ground. I'm going to like one every 2 or 3 months, and there are about 5 people. So we're very early days here. But there's something stopping that from working in Canada. I used to live in Canada when I was running my channel back in 2018, 2019. There definitely are a lot of people who sympathize behind the scenes, at least where I was at.
I mean, there's plenty of Canadians that we know. I think that it would require similar kinds of leadership to come up and see what they could organize. I know that, Canada suffers a similar problem that we do, that if you don't live where most Canadians are, which is like, 20 minutes away from the US border, then it's going to be a little difficult. But I don't see why it wouldn't be a harmful thing to find other people, especially when we know so many Canadians. We were just talking about Black Horse earlier, and we know other Canadians up there like Geo or Skeptical Waves. I just imagine that with some proper organization, it could be possible.
It does seem like it would be really possible because Canada has its dissident. It strikes me as a non-Canadian, although kind of close to them in law. It strikes me as sort of the ideal place because they have a lot of dissidents that are very close to urban centers, which means that the discontents are very tightly packed, and they're close enough to sort of what we used to call the pause, so that they're not in some kind of bubble where they think it's the 90s still, or they think they still own Canada. So once they kind of come to the awareness of their own dispossession, Canada could switch very, very quickly, it seems to me. All right, I'm going to go on here because we're short of time. Novum for $3 USA. Going to second the personality hotness in women dichotomy, I assume. Why would they need a personality if they know they're just hot? Well, that's kind of the trick, though, isn't it, Novum? What robs a woman of her personality is not her hotness or her beauty, but her awareness that it's a product that she can use to kind of get out of all other problems she might encounter. And the internet has just not helped that relationship at all. I think we've already commented on this, but
So to put a more fine point on it, at least compared to what I said earlier, what I think is that being, attractive and having that type of attention, it essentially means you never have to compromise with someone because you always have another option, right? And like, as anyone who's ever been in a relationship at all, like that's not workable.
yeah,
If you have someone who just will never make a compromise or always has, an instant escape button to get into another relationship, within the same evening, like that's just not workable. And that doesn't mean that every, highly attractive woman is like that, but it becomes more and more of a risk.
yeah, and this is the problem of modernity. What Richard Hanania said when he still had something to say: women's tears win in the marketplace of ideas, and we're emerging from a culture that gives women very little in the way of external constraints. And the problem is that our constraints create our personalities. I call it sort of the Fanny Price model of existence, right? The female personality kind of blooms forward the most radically when it has to deal with a constrained life of regulation, and where it has to find its way through a sort of Byzantine conduit in order to find the light of adoration for what it is. If it's just there to press of a button, then you just have this atrophied muscle, right? There's no striving in the female form, and that's what really. I mean, this is sort of. I mean, it's a subset of what's happened to all of us, but I feel that in this particular instance, the fairer sex, that they caught this bug first, and so they're in the most advanced stages of suffering from this particular malady of modernity. So I'll keep on going though. Stephen Townsend for $3 USA. I want to wish all the best to you and give you some pocket money, Dave. Hope to see a community and would love to see a Discord server. Looking forward to contributing in some small way this year. Well, I probably will create a Discord server because I think I lost 3 Discord servers between 2018 and 2020. I probably will start a new one because I think that the Discord ban happiness is going to be going away very prominently, and I want sort of a place to kind of filter people out. I really hate that platform. I told you the story of the one time that I applied there as an engineer. This is in 2018, and they had like 4 questions about my gender identity or whether I was trans or a sexually oppressed minority or something. They were really reaching out for those people. So, yeah, that's a particularly interesting example. But thanks very much, Steve. And I'm going to go on just so I can respect my guest's time. We're going over here. Dreadnought for $5 USA. I have to admit that as a celibate man, I've always found it odd and perhaps slightly perverse how ready married people are to recommend celibacy to single people. I almost want to recommend them to a Josephite marriage in return. P. Well, I'm not saying that like celibacy. I'm not saying like don't get married, Dreadnought. I'm not saying that. And I was a Christian for like 6 years before I got married. I understand that it's hard to struggle against the constraints of sexual requirement for Christians. All I'm saying though, and this is the only thing I was trying to say, is that so many men are celibate due to circumstances beyond their control. And I'm saying that you want to make the most out of your celibacy. And in hindsight, as somebody who's married and intimately connected to the will of woman with all its blessings, for sure, from an outside point of view, it seems like the most interesting thing about being in a position of celibacy is you can essentially tell the entire affair of sex to take a hike because you're totally disconnected from them. Not to put down what it would obviously requires to maintain celibacy and how hard that is. I don't know. Any thoughts? This might be just my futile crusade against thirst posting coming to the fore again, but
well, I can relate to that every Thursday, but I think that it's funny because I guess I've lived on both sides of the train tracks here, because like I definitely got around PU. Like I read the Rational Mail in college and got around, and like you can have your fun, and it's sometimes great to know that you can be going around and do whatever you want. But then there are times where I kind of realize, like, oh, like I was at a family reunion one time, and my aunt had said something, and it kind of like made me realize, I was like, oh, like, oh man. It's kind of different when like even your mother will jokingly refer to you as like a man whore or something, and you're like, okay, maybe there's a time to reassess. But as someone who hasn't been doing anything for quite some time now, it's been a way to, I think, understand and appreciate that, when you tell a woman no, when they're like really kind of like laying after you, or like trying to take advantage of the, monkey press button neuron activation, because they've let their personality atrophy because all that they do know is how to pose for picture, or enjoy the fact that dozens of men would line up and, let them walk all over them. I think that there's a place for both. I recognize that, yeah, like having a traditional Christian marriage is going to be very difficult in this day and age, because yes, both men were caught in a feedback loop, men and women, of sex and imagery and temptation. But at the same time, I think that it does allow you to emphasize on what skills do you want to develop, and what do you want to be, and what are you looking for in a person if you want to get married, or if you choose to be celibate. Not everyone's called to be married, and God has a wonderful way to make single people do really good things.
So, and I should say, I don't want to put myself out there as an authority, because I'm both fairly young and this is not something I'm particularly good at. But there is something inherently masculine, and I don't want to, this is going to sound gay, but kind of like powerful in being able to say no, because that means that you are making a decision, and so instead of kind of being led around by the nose, if you're, your lizard brain, that you are, whenever you're engaging in something, you're doing so rationally. And that's something that is hard to explain, but once you've experienced it, it's kind of powerful. And I think that one of the most difficult things about interacting with women is that in many ways you need to want to interact with women, but you can't let them know that you want to interact with them too much, because kind of, if you come across as too desperate, that's like almost an instant turn off. And so being able to, and this is a tactic you see in business, right? In negotiation, that you need to be able to say no, and you can't just fake it. Like you actually have to be fully comfortable with walking away from a deal, and not to transactionalize relationships, but you have to apply the same logic, and you have to be fully okay with like, oh yes, there will be no, like this will not go anywhere. And I think that having that ability is helpful both in like a spiritual sense and in just an efficacy sense.
Yeah, you heard it here, guys. This channel is not pro celibacy. We're just pro telling women no, as a general rule. Try it. It's liberating.
I'm not
celibate. Oh, well, I don't want us to be written off as Nancy Reagan, just say no to women, but it goes really far, guys. It really does.
Yeah, it does. And everyone should get married, especially all those women out there. I'm really not looking for the millennial generation of women post 40 unmarried haunts my dreams. So thanks very much, Dreadnought. I did not mean to make it sound like celibacy was easy or that I was dismissing those concerns, but I appreciate your comment. Cringe Walker for $3 USA. Ultimately, a nation without an ethos is a religion, and a religion without elders is a LARP. American progressives thus become a competing faith, and neo-pagans become an unimportant LARP. That is quite a riddle there, Cringe Walker. I do respect neo-pagans' complaints about Christianity, because in many ways I share their frustrations. But and anyone want to? I don't really have anything to say about this. Anyone want to take on Cringe Walker's sentiments about a nation without an ethos? I guess
I will take on specifically what he said about elders, which if you are in the position of looking for a religious community, your first priority should be finding an intergenerational community, because you do lose something. You do lose an iterative, like a vital force, if everyone there is old, 1 foot in the grave.
yeah.
But conversely, these kind of, and this is particularly, like, I guess, prominent in kind of like, evangelical circles of these churches of, 20 and 30 somethings, and those churches tend to be really stupid because everyone there is kind of stupid, and there's no real wisdom in the church. And so to me, at least, like, that rings very true. And for those who are kind of looking to integrate themselves with a faith community, with a church, regardless of what like specific option you've chosen, I guess that would be kind of like my first, aside from theological concerns, like my first area to kind of check out, like looking for intergenerational communities. So that kind of rings true with me.
That is a barrier that we need to break down. And it is a little difficult because of this idea of youth culture. The things that are appropriate for youth culture and the things that are appropriate to participate in as a married man, especially if you have a kid in tow, they get to be that intersection of the Venn diagram can be very narrow. So
yeah, I would agree on both points. Sorry to interject. Just the only thing I had to add was that church seems to really be the only place where the intergenerational, like, 2 minutes hate of millennials hating boomers or Gen Xers like having lamentations about Gen Z doesn't seem to exist as much. And I think J Burden is right 100% that if you're going to have that, you need to go find a place with intergenerational dialogue, because what is sort of like modern progressivism other than riddling old baby boomers just sort of like being taken for a ride by these young people? Like, does Biden really care or believe in whatever Dylan Mulvaney has to say about, like, this is being her quote unquote 256th as a woman? Like, the way he said God bless you for it tells me that he knows that he just has to play nice for the camera. Or
God bless your transgender heart. God bless your transgender heart.
It's exactly like that. And it's the young and the restless that are, on camera, it looks like that they're leading a charge when they're really playing into these old decrepit boomers that are like, okay, maybe these guys can replace us after we're gone. Who knows? But you really do need that intergenerational dialogue. And one of my favorite streams that Jay Burden has ever done is that he had himself and Ace, Aaron, talking to Semyagog about Gen X. Just two Zoomers asking questions. And I was like, we need more of that, because how much intergenerational wisdom have we lost, either due to the internet or our other problems of modernity, like single parenthood or whatnot? Like, it's very strange when I see YouTube channels like Dad, How Do I Do This? Or How to Dad, because it's like, well, that really indicates how much we've kind of lost from one generation to the next.
Rebuilding that is going to be, I think it's a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation, considering we're already over time. If you guys have to leave, that's fine. I can answer super chats, but if you want to stay, you're welcome as well. Ben White, again, for $5. My friend just got back from Taipei. He said the city is a lot more fun and happier than American cities like Seattle. However, he did remark that it was more openly materialistic, with people openly declaring desires to get rich for Chinese New Year's. I feel like Chinese people asking to be rich for Chinese New Year's is almost a Chinese stereotype that predates the 20th century. I mean, I'm not really an expert on Chinese stereotypes, but maybe the Franklin could correct me on this. Somehow, Chinese people wishing to be rich on New Year's, just I kind of would expect that, I guess. Any thoughts?
I just imagine someone throwing a penny into a well, praying, God, please make me a crazy rich Asian. But I don't know enough on this issue. I just find that that's an interesting anecdote.
Crazy Rich Asians. I never saw the movie, but I never saw sort of like you can just imagine the sort of cultural studies focus group that put that title together. You have a bunch of like Asian studies majors trying to brainstorm words that will bring a largely Asian crowd into a movie.
Without naming which specific Asian family, I guess, because they have much more of a well-known racicial consciousness than we Westerners do.
We can't call it Crazy Rich Koreans because then the Chinese and Japanese people won't come. They have to be as ambiguous as possible, but it has to be explicit that they're rich. Anyway, I'm going to go on here. So Creeper Weirdo for $5 USA. You guys ever watch A Clockwork Orange? It's literally made for us. I feel like we should be looking for art like that. Books, comics, movies, etc. Well, this is a conversation I had on Twitter this week about right-wing art. I do agree. I mean, I'm kind of not an expert, but I love finding right-wing themes in movies made by liberals like Stanley Kubrick. My desire for right-wing art is I see a few things here and there that are really kind of stand out. You know, I'm ordering the Passage Prize now that the price has come down. But a lot of the problems I see with right-wingers in art is they have what I call the damn good hamburger perspective on art. Like, so you know, you have a burger joint that makes the burger you like, and then Woke Incorporated takes over that burger joint and they start producing crap burgers. But luckily, Base Burger opens up down the street, and then you go to Base Burger and you get the hamburger and you're like, that's a damn good hamburger. That's not exactly what I look for in art. I don't want sort of like, my problem isn't that I had a consumable and then that got corrupted by wokeness, and now I want a product that is no longer corrupted by wokeness. I want art that is fresh and new and feels like nothing I've ever seen before, and communicates a desire I never knew I had for a type of artistic experience that I never experienced before, or not in quite the same way, I should say. And so I think, you know, this idea of iterating on consumable products is oftentimes, I think, that traps our conversation on art a little bit. I don't know if you guys have a similar perspective.
Well, I've been greatly appreciating the literary scene a lot more as of late, and I've sort of made it an effort that every book that I've read by someone who's been published either through sort of a, you know, Friends of the Right publishing house, or someone that the New Right WORITE podcast recommends, that I try my best to give it a shot, and if I like their work, I'll try my best to bring them on and talk about it. So I think that it's important for us to hear sides, or to have artistic, especially, and I can only speak from a literary sense because I haven't really perused much of the art or the folk song about it. I know that there is a guy named Nullis. He's a Hungarian gentleman that's sort of connected to that scene, but I like what the writing scene has produced. There's books that I can easily recommend to people, whether it's T.R. Hudson's Automaton, which sort of takes a look at what would it be like if someone like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs wanted to wage drone warfare on the country, or more recently, a guy named Dan Baltic wrote this great book called Nutcranker, which is basically political satire about some enlightened, you know, progressive sort of right-winger who, you know, ends up dating and falling and down to becoming a coomer and going to the Women's March and being de-radicalized. Like, it's really good political satire. It made me think about some people I know in the real world and Richard Spencer. And I was just like, this is good stuff. And it makes me kind of optimistic that, like, the right-wing art scene isn't just a, damn, that's a great hamburger, but like, oh no, these people have experiences and stories that are actually good, that aren't explicitly political. I mean, that one was, because it's satire, but I mean, even Semyagog has a great science fiction book, you know, Viniculum, which is fantastic, and I need to bring him on sometime to interview him. But I'm optimistic about the art scene, at least in terms of literature.
And I will mention friend of the channel's book, Wards of NC, always the Franklin. But yeah, I mean, the art scene is, I think it's up and coming, and I'm not a great reader. So I'm all of those things you've mentioned, Prude. When you mentioned them, I remember that they're on my list to actually read. I just haven't had the time, as kind of a, you know, a wagey that also has a family, but it's there, and I probably don't do a good service by describing it as sort of replacement consumables that that's probably not fair, and it certainly isn't fair to the people highlighted on podcasts like The New Right and stuff like that. But I just noticed that as being an intellectual trap that a lot of people fall into when they think about what art would look like. But anyway, yes. Thank you very much. Ben White, $3. The West is materialistic, but in a different way. What is the connection between materialism and decline in the West? Is materialism all that's left after the sole religion of a society dies? Well, I think that was Spengler's theory that sort of the Chinese mercantilist spirit was due to the fact that the civilization had mummified, I guess. I'm probably butchering Spengler.
Well, I mean, Spengler's point about the Chinese is that kind of culture did kind of petrify itself, and it was sort of frozen in place. And he was looking forward to other parts like Russia to sort of advance where that would come next. But I think death denialism came really out of the West with these sort of modern innovations. I mean, what was COVID really for the regular person than the absolute rejection of mortality and being afraid of it for the first time in what probably felt like a century, since all these little flu scares disappeared, and the last great memory is either the plague of the plague or the flu of 1918. And what did people do? Well, they bought more stuff, they consumed more online, they watched more Netflix, and they gained 40 pounds, and they're arguably more unhealthy now than they were before the pandemic started. And I
they
think
patted
that
themselves on the back.
yeah, and they
for
patted
being the
themselves on the
heroic
back, right? Like
generation.
I'm doing what's necessary. I'm a good boy. I'm a hero. I'm saving lives. I'm staying home. And because we deny death, we deny our mortality in the West. What becomes the sort of sacramentality of death denialism than just buying more useless things and trinkets to sort of try and fill that God-shaped hole in your heart that you have, even though you don't want to admit it.
I'm going to steal J Burden's line and say I completely agree, Prudentialist. I don't feel like I think we are being plagued by materialism, but the death denialism is the leading edge of our. This isn't like the 70s where we're buying A-tracks and convertibles and having vintage record collections of Led Zeppelin and stuff like that. And no one's having a good time with this consumption. It's all just stuff to numb yourself so you can convince yourself that you're simultaneously moral and never going to die.
Well,
All
this
right.
is sorry.
Yeah,
Can I just
go
add
ahead. Yeah,
one
yeah.
thing? When I talk about the new state religion, this is kind of what I mean is that before, right, there was still this emptiness. There was this kind of this pointless society, but there was enough kind of consumer advances to fill that hole. And what I think that we're seeing more broadly is kind of this realization that consumerism isn't working anymore as a substitute. And so there's this kind of scramble for, a new God to fill the hole. And I think that that's why you've seen this kind of like new age of, faiths where, for many people, politics has become a religion, and it provides them not the real thing, but kind of like an imitation of meaning, and so in many cases, when I talk to older people who don't understand, like, oh, why is everything so political now? It's essentially become because politics has become a consumer product. And so those same mechanisms of consumerism that we learned in previous generations are still operating. It's just that it's not a physical product anymore. It's an ideological one.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think that's well said. I'm going to keep on going because I want to see the end of this soon. Cringe Walker for $3. I've been saying for years the right wing should start believing in undeniably sane things to force the left to adopt insane opposites. AA sensible centrism is a good step towards this. Well, I agree. If sensible centrism just means mainstreaming and coming out of the closet, then I am there 100%. I found it very difficult to force the left to do things. I'm told that people did that in 2016 on 4chan. But I never been able, manipulating what the left says has been very hard because of the power asymmetry. But that being said, I can just wait and the left will say some batshit insane thing every other day. So I don't know if I'm really holding my breath on this one. Any thoughts, guys?
I don't think you need to poke the left and by. I mean, okay, men are men and women are women, and women don't have, genitalia that dangles between their legs, right? Like, obviously, sane and normal things has been things that the right has said for a while, and if they do it all on their own and go nuts. I don't know if I need to prod them to do it. I think the only linguistic trick that has really gotten under their skin was it's okay to be white and Islam was right about women. Like, those are the only two like really weird tricks
What is
I
a
wa-
woman was another one too.
Oh yeah, what is a woman? Right. Those have been the big three that I've watched. Sort of linguistically, they kind of twist themselves into pretzel knots about. But I
What
mean,
works against the left are very, very simple statements of fact or value
yeah,
that nobody could disagree with, but that something in their ideology compels them to countersignal. That's the common form to all of these things. That's the common form to Islam is right about women. That's the common form to it's okay to be white and what is a woman. And the more and more you can create these very, very anodyne statements that create a situation where the left is forced to deny the sort of plainly obvious or the plainly moral, then you've got a working meme against them. And the more that meme can be pushed into the mainstream, and the more effective it is.
I have been enjoying on Twitter when like progressive pastors or progressive priests say something, and then some frog on Twitter will just be like, can you say Christ is Lord? And then watch them go nuts. That's been
Oh,
somewhat entertaining.
they don't say
They don't.
they don't. Oof. Man, I mean, the progressive pastor is a figure that has kind of haunted me a little bit as a convert. It's something that I really don't like saying. It's a deeply uncomfortable figure in my own imagination. I know the story about why they exist. It's just it's so depressing to think that they were in contact with something that I consider so strong, and then chose this thing that I consider to be so fake over it. It's a psychologically hard thing for me to touch, so I'm not surprised that I don't see their cringe takes on Twitter. All right, I'm gonna keep on going. Okay, so Creeper Weirdo for $5. Can we give up on Nick Fuentes already? He's clearly not a serious person. Just edgy. It's a just be edgy and crap your pants on camera based takes. I think Nick Fuentes might be on his way out finally. That's my impression. But I really don't have any contact with him. But to me, the Kanye thing, once you get an audience with the president and you use it for something like the Kanye West fiasco, it's hard to really know where to go.
So I searching for synonyms, I find myself in agreement with you. How's that for a tortured transition? But to me, at least, I try not to start drama. I try not to have, right-wing fights. But to me, at this point, I feel like he's shown how seriously he takes this, and obviously, look, like you've said before, like the right owns meme culture, and that's good. It's good to have that kind of like fun-loving spirit. But there comes a certain point where it's like, what was the point of all of this? Was the point just to drive clout? Was the point to make it all a big joke? Because like, okay, maybe that's funny, when it's a small platform, and maybe it's still kind of funny when it's a medium platform. But there comes a certain point at which it's like, okay, man, like, when are you going to start taking this seriously, or is this just a joke forever? In which case, it's like, okay, man, like I just don't have a ton of time for that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add is that, whether or not of your opinion of him, like I think that a lot of people do walk a fine line, because regardless of what you may think of him, all it takes is one sort of remark to go through the grapevine, and then someone's attacking you for a tweet or a take and accusing you of being all kinds of three-letter words, or three-letter federal intelligence agencies and law enforcement groups before it's on there. It's whether or not he's on his way out. I think it indicates that he's got a cult of personality that means even if he's resigned to cozy.tv for the rest of his life, he will probably survive just fine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't put it past Nick to make a comeback, but he's going to have to prove he doesn't need to prove to me that he's popular. He needs to prove to me that he's serious. I know he's got a following, and that's and that's going to be a harder hill for him to surmount than just to prove that he's the thing that's trending today on Twitter. All right, cool. Moving right along, Ben White for $5 USA. Another thing my friend said is that people in Taiwan, even young women, work 12 hours and then go out drinking with coworkers. I wonder how people have time to date and get married. The West has the opposite problem. People have sex but don't work. That's true in some areas of the West. I mean, Asia is obviously collapsing demographically. They might, what is it, the guy Peter Zahan, who thinks that China is just on its way down the tubes because of a demographic implosion.
And he's been saying that for 30 years. But yeah, I mean, almost every major industrialized country in East Asia their TFR rates have sunk well below replacement levels. And I think India's has finally fallen below as well. So, I think it's a sign, right? That sometimes, this, to really refute Fukuyama, it's not that, the end of history leads towards liberal democracy. It means that you can't export it everywhere, because if you export it everywhere, you're going to literally demographically destroy entire nations and peoples.
Yeah, I think that Zahan I take very seriously. I know that he's been like a Chicken Little, but that reminds me of is the housing crisis, because there are people saying that the housing crisis is a bubble for 30 years. And that's because it was a 30-year long bubble. And how useful is it to be 30 years ahead of the truth when you can't run a short that long? I guess doesn't help you that much, but
I mean, I read him since I started doing geopolitical work on the channel. I mean, I think that he's right about demographics. I think that the people that throw him off on other things are where he kind of gets a lot of his Chicken Little stuff, like his takes on crypto or things like that. I think his geopolitical viewpoint is still very much a 19th century style worldview, but I think the demographics thing is something that people have to pay attention to.
All right, I'm going to keep on going. Trey 50 Daniel for $10 USA. I think right-wingers need to learn how to use all of their collective working capital to engineer the solutions they need outside of depending on megacorps. The issue is how to convey that message to normies. Well, we definitely have a funding problem. Very few right-wingers can go professional. And even running conferences is difficult from a funding point of view because of the incredible travel distances involved inside America. So we definitely have a funding problem in that regard. But I don't know, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agreed with your funding problem. I mean, we're all sort of going after the same sort of middle class individuals. I mean, I know Bogby from the Good Old Boys makes it very clear that you need some kind of patronage network. But I mean, it's kind of interesting when we live in the inversion of like 1990s shit libs where, they were the ones protesting the World Trade Organization and wanting to shop local. And like we mentioned earlier with like raw milk or raw eggs. And now those are intrinsically right-wing ideas. I think people still want to shop local. I don't know a single person that I talk to on a regular basis that likes Walmart or likes Target or likes going to large grocery chains or things like that, with the exception of maybe like Sam's Club or Costco, because that's pretty nice. But I think that if we were to finance, and I think this is why 2023 should be like really the year of business, or the year, which is terrible because we're about to enter a recession. But I think that it's important for us to have a network that says that we can rely on friends or friends of friends that can distribute goods and services, where I'm not going to Megacorp or I'm not relying on, Amazon.com.
Well, not to cut J Burden off, but the next super chat is related to this point, and it's definitely directed towards Prudentialist. Corbin Ransley for $5 USA. Would anyone like to speak about the Old Glory Club? I've been a little out of the loop on that recently. So a Prudentialist, you've been much more...
I can happily talk about the Old Glory Club, and with all three of us that are also a part of it. In fact, they're meeting right now. But the Old Glory Club is not just another YouTube channel or another Substack with regards to focusing on American culture and history and politics. And while we do those things, the capital that's being allocated is to go towards making sure that Americans have resources and a network that they can rely on in case of cancellation, in case of force majeure or acts of God instances where we can rely on our friends, so that if geographically speaking you need someone to help you move, you have access to that. Or if you need someone to raise awareness for a project that you're working on that's happening inside the United States that can bring people up, then we want that to be heard, because there are other guys that are doing this as well. But I think that when people know us already, either, myself, the Potentialist, J Burden, Dave, Radlib, Charlemagne, and so many others that are on board with this project, that want to ensure that we as Americans are not deracinated and uprooted from our cultures and history, and have access to resources that can help us, whether we are unemployed or are moving across the country, that we have that and we can meet up with people and succeed in the future. And that's what the Old Glory Club is about. It's a return to the early 20th century mutual aid society.
Excellent. Yeah, I would be more involved. The meeting times are a little bit hard for me to make, but I see my role in this online space as much more a role of service. Obviously, this is not my profession, and I just want to know how I can help people make the next step. Like the fact that R.N. McIntyre essentially went mainstream this year. Like that's a step. That's a step in a direction that we can't discount. And the fact that it's somebody else's good luck or fortune, that's immaterial. These are historical things that just need to happen. And some people will be the spearheads and some people will be the support structure. And I'm fine being the support structure if that's what's required. All right. I've really been discounting Jay Burden. Maybe you want to take this next one. Corbin Ramsley again. Thoughts on DeSantis and the establishment types who like him over Trump. His actions make me like him, but the people his actions make me like him, but the people who like him ... implying that he doesn't like the people who like DeSantis.
Yeah, that's fair. And look, like I'm not exactly the most up to date on like day-to-day political stuff. Like I'm kind of passively aware of it, but I know a lot of, shall we say, normal Republicans. My take is, one, he seems like a smart, canny political operator. I also think that, in regards to, let's just say, his geopolitical commitments, given the state he's in, that was inevitable. Given Miami, given the demographics of that, like that was to a certain degree going to happen no matter what. And I realize for some people that's a deal breaker, but I do think that's just kind of how the sausage is made in the GOP, at least currently, right? So, I mean, here's hoping. I'm not super convinced that an extra good Republican candidate will be able to fix things, but I mean, DeSantis at least seems competent, which is pretty rare in a Republican. I find myself generally sympathetic to the people who say I'd rather keep him in Florida, than send him to DC. But I guess I understand the feelings, but I'm cautiously optimistic. But I hope he doesn't get selected as president, because I think he would just get subsumed into the swamp and his potential would be wasted.
Yeah, I kind of consider it out of my hands. I hope you don't mind me just going on, because I'm really trying to get to the end of these things that keep on accumulating. Dreadnought for $3. Dave, to clarify, my comment about celibacy recommendations was tongue-in-cheek. I value chastity. That said, I don't need every other old woman at my parish suggesting I be a priest or a monk. Yeah, I think that's the case. If I could wave my magic wand, marriage would be a default. I certainly don't want to see the priesthood be kind of a collection of all young men who have problems finding mates. That's a horrible solution for all involved. But yeah, point taken, Dreadnought. Thank you very much. TN 1000 for $3 USA. That's a question I've been asking. What happens to all the millennials who are not getting married and then they get sick or injured and no one is there to support them? Well, that's obvious. They become dependent on the states and they become clients of the states, the state. Our current government is basically a giant machine for creating clients and maintaining client classes, groups of people that have to vote for them because they're dependent and have no independence of their own. That's how the system works. Any other comments on that one?
I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming decade here in the United States, the assisted suicide / maid discourse becomes legislation here in certain states.
I think that certainly will. I'm amazed at how much that accelerated in Canada, and I'm not going to go on a rant about Richard Hanania here, so I'll just.
Oh, that article made my skin crawl. I hated that
It's just
article.
like it's every shitlib tactic, but used by a person must know better because they've been used against him, right? Anyway, but I'm not going to go over the Richard Hanania question again. Cringe Walker for USA $3. As John Michael Greer said, listen carefully by Nietzsche's grave for God. You can hear the grave diggers bury progress there too. Yeah. Listen carefully by Nietzsche's grave for God. You can hear the grave diggers bury progress there too. Well, I mean, yeah, this is anyone who knows our 19th century history knows that progress is the child of providence, and providence was the sort of Anglican name for God that deists liked using in the early 19th century. Yeah, I mean, progress is absolutely the heretical Christian God, and I don't think God's dying, but the concept of progress certainly will. Any thoughts?
I actually completely agree with you, and I think that. Oh, damn it! I said it again.
You're gonna get Charlemagne so drunk.
see, really, that was my goal all along, right?
Yeah.
No, but what I meant to say is that I think that a lot of the dread, this kind of like scrambling you see in progressive circles, because it does seem like a lot of people kind of feel like the wheels are coming off, and I think that is in many ways we're seeing the death of progress. That there's this idea that like, oh, things are always getting better. And that was a Whig history was something that it was kind of easy to believe in for a very long time. But I think that it's getting harder to realize harder to square that when even during my life, material conditions have gotten measurably worse for most people. And I think that the Band-Aid of the Skinner box, the Band-Aid of the internet will only last so long. And I think that even if people haven't verbalized it, they've realized it.
Yeah, I mean, what's the phrase I've heard around is that the humming and sound of technological innovation was a great way to mask the stench of a rotting corpse in the West in terms of culture and religiosity, until of course the machine stops. And I think that's where we're at, is where we're finally noticing decreased life expectancy, increased drug overdoses. We're watching our airline industry fall apart in a lot of ways, and people are seriously wondering, well, clearly something has to give. And I think that it's really going to be a wake-up call when something does give and people don't have the culture, the network, or the faith to carry on.
Well said. Dreadnought for $3 USA. The say Christ is Lord and risen from the dead thing is the witch test. I think Brian Niemeyer invented it. It really does work, and he's worth reading and talking to. I actually don't know who Brian Niemeyer is. Do you know who this person is? Niemeier. Okay, I think you stumped all of us, Dreadnought. I'll look up that person when I get a chance. But yeah, I mean, it's a great witch test. So, but I'll go on because I'm really over time. John Leo Ginid for $3 USA. It would be nice to see a project by right wingers from around the world that actually burrs something fruitful in real life. Cheers from the third world. Well, yeah, here's my hope for the right wing version of the slow food movement, but I don't know. I feel like we're always on the cusp of developing something like that. Any thoughts?
Well, and again, I don't mean to turn every conversation into a conversation about Dreyer, but I do think that he was kind of getting at something with with the idea of a crunchy con.
Yeah, he was. Yeah,
and I think that because again, I'm in this like largely Christian area, there was kind of a flicker of that with millennials. That I know a lot of people who are kind of, crunchy cons, who are these kind of, a lot of them were Ron Paul types, who essentially were like, all right, like I'm a conservative, like generally right-wing person, but the excesses of the Bush era are wrong. And a lot of those people went into homesteading, went into, kind of, I guess, like applied, like conservative belief in a weird way. And many of them are just not connected. A lot of them have a lot of kids, which again is great, but it means that they're not really in dialogue with us in our spheres. I know a lot of people like that. And so I guess there's some kind of hope. I think a lot of those people already exist. It's just getting in contact with them.
I think that this barrier it's disintegrating. It will fall apart. The distant right online will become one with the crunchy conservative lifestyle in the real world.
Yeah, it's well on its way to being that, considering how many of the points and the Twitter interactions and even when Pedro Gonzalez did that whole little thread about, well, what happens now since these people are being listened to, and it's just like, you're showing your cards there, Mr. Gonzalez. Like, we want to roll this sort of DR space into this like crunchy con American conservative Hillsdale College kind of environment, when most people would rather, have your job or, not have you be their representative at all.
I think like characters like Peachy Keenan and a lot of people from the what was that? The Claremont Institute. Yeah. These walls are coming down. That the National Review conservative counter signaling and barriers are gone. If you want to be a serious person on the right, you have to engage with ideas from the far right. That's just the name of the game. And pretending like there's some kind of ability to keep the liberal norms in place is just kind of a thing of the past. And I think, people engage better in this sphere too. Once people stop doing this thing where they feel like they have to not get the right-wing cooties, everyone just relaxes. Everyone can be human beings for once. And that's the utility. All right, I'm going to keep on going here. Okay, John Lino Guinea for $3. He says, what's the biggest lesson the right can offer to developing countries that haven't picked up on what's going on right now? That's a good question. Prudentialist, you're the expert on world affairs. I do know that the State Department's ability to promise wealth to future underdeveloped countries has been waning precipitously. But I am not sure if that corresponds with anything.
Well, I would say that the right wing, I guess, here in the West, the greatest example that you could teach developing countries or those in the developing world, whatever term you want to use, is the importance of maintaining your cultural norms. Because the United States State Department is good at one thing, and it is deterritorialization and uprooting you from your culture and your beliefs. Because it became very quickly in Afghanistan and Iraq about a war on terror and sort of this Revan-kissed crusade revenge story on for 9/11 to 3 cups of tea and girls' education and girls' school and LGBT rights. And you had generals are lamenting that we were leaving Afghanistan because the gay rights community was going to like go up in smoke in Afghanistan. And so I cannot stress it enough that if you're in a developing country, or just to answer this hypothetical, stay clear and true to your culture. Do not lose it and fight for it tooth and nail at every chance you can, because every hill when you're a developing country is worth dying on when someone wants to introduce your kids to drag queen story hour.
Yeah. Do not allow them to deracinate you. Your people are your greatest treasure. Your legacy is the legacy of your faith and of your children. And don't let them take that away from you, because that's what will keep your nation a nation into the future. That's what will keep your people healthy. And don't make the mistake that the West did and believe their lies. I don't know what they're really offering third world countries, so I can't really understand the trade-offs directly, but I know that danger is there. Okay, last super chat, then I can let you gentlemen go. Prince of Parma for $3 USA. Lamentably, I have to spend real money rather than my customary 75 cents. I do wonder if I will get people here who think the topic of discussion is about a nuclear physics or something. Oh, wow.
So I should say that's reference to me making fun of Prince of Parma for sending me super chats, which I do appreciate, but he sends them in South African rand because of the conversion means that he can essentially write as much as he wants for like a pocket full of change. And so I was kind of gently making fun of him for it. So that's the context on that.
Well, thank you very much, Prince of Parma. But we are not
Yeah,
actually
he
splitting
did that
the
to me
atom
the
here.
other day. 75 cents. It's been, when in South Africa, do as the rand tells you.
Well, we're an entropy here. We've got standards. So there you go. Well, gentlemen, I think that's the end of the super chats. I don't know if there's a question there. So at any rate, I think it was a good discussion. Thank you so much for coming on. And I know I'll be talking more to both Prudentialist and J Burden in the future. So I won't belabor you guys. But if you want to show right now, just tell people where they can find your work. And obviously, most of my subscribers know about you already. But for those who don't, just maybe a slight outro.
So obviously the Jay Burden Show is my channel. You can find that on YouTube, Apple, Spotify. And that's a roughly 3 to 4 times a week interview show. I actually, speaking of South Africa and my channel, I have an episode with Conscious Caracal premiering on my channel in 20 minutes. So if you want to check it out, it's going live soon. And in general, if it's someone in our circles, I've probably talked to them or plan to talk to them in the future. And again, I'm not going to belabor the point, but if you guys want to check it out, that's where you can find me.
Okay, Prudentialist, even though you need no introduction, where can we find you?
Well, thank you again so much, Dave, for having me on. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and to sort of interact with our work. We kind of always talk past each other when we talk about our articles or essays, because I reference you all the time, and you've done it a few times before. But of course, you can find me all on YouTube, Odyssey, Telegram, Twitter, all the things Prudentialist with this froggy profile picture at findmyfriends.net/The Prudentialist. I will have a new video out tomorrow discussing the concept of the leftist ratchet and why it does turn leftward and what keeps it from going back to the right, which is the Paul, to talk a little bit about mechanics. And that will be premiering tomorrow, right before the cigar stream. So if you're interested in that, by all means, head on over. And I cover geopolitics every Saturday on my channel at 2 p.m. Eastern. And every Thursday, you can find me with Gio Panischetti, talking about all things culture, the internet, and Lord knows what else.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming on. To my audience, I'll probably see you next week for a more regular podcast. In the meantime, cheers and blessings, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Good night.